Hey everyone! Tonight we journey into the quiet, intricate world of ancient Rome, a world where every life, every hand, every laborer had a price. A society so vast and meticulously organized that even those who lived outside the city walls, farmers, artisans and travelers, could sense the rhythms of its economy in the air around them. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of our journeys into the past. And take a moment to like the video and subscribe the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to glimpse the corners of the world joining us tonight. Now, dim the lights, perhaps let a soft breeze or the gentle hum of a fan surround you. And as we breathe in the calm, let's ease into the quiet markets and bustling streets of Rome, where wealth, power, and the lives of countless individuals intertwined. Tonight we explore a delicate, often overlooked aspect of Roman life, the cost of slaves, how their value was measured, and what this tells us about the society that traded human lives as carefully as it traded gold, grain, and silver. In the heart of the Mediterranean, the city of Rome spread its influence over lands, rivers, and hills, not only through armies and conquest, but also through the quiet, constant hum of commerce, labor, and structured society. The Roman world, at its height, was vast, stretching across the Italian peninsula and beyond, from the sun-baked coasts of Hispania to the fertile plains of Egypt, from the bustling marketplaces of Gaul to the olive groves of North Africa. Within this sprawling territory, a complex economy thrived, supported by agriculture, craftsmanship, trade, and a meticulously organized network of roads, ports, and cities that allowed goods and people to move across hundreds of miles with surprising efficiency. Rome's wealth, both visible and intangible, rested on many pillars, but among the most central, and yet most quietly integrated, was the institution of slavery, which permeated almost every aspect of daily life, labor, and social hierarchy. The Roman economy, in essence, was a mix of subsistence and commercial activity. While a significant portion of the population engaged in farming primarily for their own families, larger estates known as latifundia produced surplus grain, olives, and wine that fed cities and fueled trade. These estates were labor-intensive, and much of the work was carried out by slaves, who were seen as both property and productive laborers. They tilled the soil, harvested crops, tended livestock, and maintained the infrastructure that supported the lives of free citizens. Beyond agriculture, slaves also worked in households as attendants, cooks and teachers, in workshops as skilled artisans, and in mines and quarries under often brutal conditions. Their labor allowed free citizens, especially those of the upper classes, to devote themselves to political life, military service and leisure, creating a society in which visible power, social status, and wealth were intimately tied to the hidden work of the enslaved. Economic life in Rome was also deeply influenced by trade and commerce. The Mediterranean Sea served as a vast highway, connecting provinces, cities and markets. Roman merchants, traveling in boats and caravans, transported goods from distant lands, spices from India, silk from the Far East, wine from Gaul, grain from Egypt. Within cities, markets bustled with the sale of food, clothing, pottery, and other necessities, alongside the more somber and regulated buying and selling of human labor. Slavery was not merely a domestic institution, but a market-driven phenomenon. Prices fluctuated according to supply, demand, skill, and condition. The market was an intricate reflection of the broader economic landscape, shaped by war, conquest, politics, and demographic shifts. A poor harvest or a victorious military campaign could ripple through cities and villages, raising or lowering the value of laborers who were themselves considered commodities. Understanding this framework is essential to appreciating why slaves were so closely monitored, bought, sold, and valued with care. Within Roman society, the hierarchical structure of wealth and class was also mirrored in the ownership and use of slaves. The elite, or patricians, often possessed dozens or even hundreds of slaves, using them to manage estates, conduct business, or serve in luxurious domestic roles. The equestrians and wealthy plebeians also relied on enslaved labor, though typically in smaller numbers or in more specialized functions. Even modest households might have one or two slaves, performing tasks that freed the family from the most laborious duties and allowed them to focus on their trades, craft, or civic responsibilities. Slavery was thus both an economic necessity and a status symbol. A house with many slaves was a house of prestige, reflecting wealth and social standing, while the careful management of these slaves demonstrated the owner's acumen and attention to detail. From the smallest household to the largest estate, the institution of slavery intertwined with the rhythm of Roman life, often invisibly shaping the experiences of the free population as much as those of the enslaved. The city itself, Rome, was a hub of both economic activity and social display. Streets filled with merchants, craftsmen, and laborers, alongside fountains, temples, and forums where the elite conducted business and politics. The visible bustle of the marketplace, the weight of coin exchanged for goods, and the constant movement of goods and people created an impression of order and prosperity. Yet behind these scenes lay layers of economic dependence on human labor. Slaves were fundamental to urban life. They cleaned streets, carried water, served meals, maintained workshops, and even acted as scribes and teachers. Their presence was pervasive yet largely unacknowledged by the casual observer, and their cost reflected not only the immediate labor they could provide, but also the social, political, and economic utility they offered to owners and to society as a whole. Economic fluctuations also shaped the perception and valuation of slaves. During times of military expansion, when prisoners of war were plentiful, the supply of slaves increased, often causing prices to drop for ordinary laborers, while maintaining or even increasing the value of skilled or exotic slaves. Conversely, during periods of internal unrest, famine or disease, the scarcity of available labor could dramatically raise the cost of acquisition. Roman writers, including Pliny the Elder and Cicero, occasionally referenced these dynamics, noting that slaves were bought and sold with a keen eye toward age, skill, health, and origin, much like other commodities that influenced wealth and power. To understand the Roman economy fully is to understand how the valuation of human life, as represented by slaves, was woven into the fabric of daily existence, from private homes to sprawling estates, from bustling city streets to distant provincial fields. The importance of slavery was not only practical, but also cultural. It reinforced social hierarchies and demonstrated the reach of Roman power. A large household with many slaves was a visible symbol of dominance, wealth, and sophistication. The management of slaves required careful attention to discipline, health, and morale, as the loss of productivity could have significant economic consequences. Owners often invested in the training of slaves, providing education, crafting skills, or even artistic instruction to increase their utility, and thus their market value. This constant evaluation of human worth, according to skill and productivity, became a subtle but pervasive feature of Roman economic thinking, shaping decisions in markets, homes, and estates alike. As the sun rose and fell over the Roman countryside, the hum of the economy continued, unnoticed by many yet powered by countless hands in servitude. Grain was harvested, wine pressed, looms turned, and coins exchanged, all within a carefully orchestrated system that depended on order, labor, and the perception of value. The Roman economy, vast and intricate, created a society in which slaves were simultaneously invisible in daily observation and indispensable in function. Their presence was so central that to consider Rome without slavery would be to imagine a city without movement, without trade, without its characteristic hum of life and commerce. And within this economic and social landscape, the valuation of slaves, how much a human could be bought or sold for, was not a mere statistic, but a reflection of a society that measured its world in terms of productivity, utility, and social standing. This understanding of Rome's economic landscape naturally leads to a closer examination of how slavery itself originated and evolved within Roman society. For the supply of human labor was the foundation upon which the valuation system rested. It was within wars, conquests, piracy, and debt that the first streams of enslaved individuals flowed into the markets, setting the stage for the complex and nuanced system of pricing that would develop over centuries, influenced by both human skill and the caprices of fortune. As the Roman economy expanded, stretching its influence across the Mediterranean and into distant provinces. The demand for labor grew alongside the city's reach. The acquisition of slaves was a process as varied as the empire itself, drawing from the tumult of war, the uncertainties of debt, the tragedies of piracy, and the unceasing cycle of birth within already enslaved populations. To understand the economic and social dynamics of Roman slavery, it is necessary to consider these origins, for the ways in which people entered servitude had a direct influence on their valuation, their roles, and the rhythms of Roman life. War was perhaps the most visible and historically significant source of slaves. Rome's constant military engagements, from early campaigns in Italy to the expansive conquests of the Punic Wars and the campaigns in Gaul and Hispania, produced a steady flow of captives. Soldiers returning from battlefields often brought with them prisoners, who were then sold in markets across the city and its territories. These captives varied widely in age, health and skill, but all were considered property to be assessed, priced, and allocated according to their perceived value. The influx of war captives could affect the market in noticeable ways. After a particularly successful campaign, the sudden availability of large numbers of slaves might lower the price of ordinary laborers, as the market became temporarily saturated. Conversely, rare individuals with useful skills, education, or physical attributes could command exceptional sums, even amidst a surplus. The constant ebb and flow of war thus directly influenced the economics of slavery, linking the fortunes of distant campaigns with the daily transactions in Roman marketplaces. Piracy was another, less ceremonious but equally significant source of slaves. The Mediterranean, while a conduit for trade, was also a theatre for opportunistic raiding. Coastal towns and shipping lanes were vulnerable to bands of pirates who captured travelers and sailors, selling them into bondage. These enslaved individuals were often transported to urban centers for auction, where they entered the same economic system as war captives. The origins of these slaves could influence their value. Those taken from distant or exotic regions, unfamiliar in language and culture to Roman buyers, were often prized for novelty, while others, already trained or familiar with agricultural or domestic work, could command higher prices for immediate utility. The unpredictable nature of piracy meant that supply could fluctuate sharply, sometimes introducing rare individuals into the market, sometimes causing waves of sudden availability that shifted prices across regions. Debt was a more intimate domestic source of slavery, reflecting the interweaving of personal misfortune and economic necessity. Roman citizens who failed to meet financial obligations could be forced to sell themselves or family members into servitude, a practice legally and socially recognized in various forms. The children of indebted parents could also be consigned to slavery, ensuring that economic failures reverberated across generations. This mechanism of internal supply differed from war or piracy in that it was not a product of conquest or chance, but of legal and economic structures. Slaves obtained in this manner often had known lineage, age, and condition, which could influence price in nuanced ways. Buyers could assess health, temperament, and family background, creating a market in which intimate knowledge of an individual could determine value. Birth within the enslaved population represented another steady long-term source of human labor. Children born to enslaved mothers automatically assumed the status of their mother, entering the system as property from the moment of birth. This internal reproduction contributed to the sustainability of the slave economy and influenced pricing across generations. Because these individuals were reared within the social and labor structures of the household or estate, they often required less training or adaptation, making them attractive investments. The continuous reproduction of the enslaved population also had economic consequences for pricing. Markets could anticipate a steady, albeit slow, increase in available labor, adjusting valuations accordingly. Young children were typically less expensive than adults, but the potential for future labor often made them valuable to households planning long-term management of estates or workshops. The geographic and cultural origins of slaves further influenced their market dynamics. Captives from regions recently subdued by Rome might be considered particularly strong or adaptable, while those from distant lands could carry a premium due to perceived exotic qualities. Historical sources suggest that the origins of individuals were meticulously noted in markets, not merely for practical assessment, but also as a marker of prestige for owners seeking novelty or status. Wars in Gaul, Hispania, and the Eastern Mediterranean provided diverse populations of captives, each with distinct physical characteristics, skills, and cultural knowledge that could influence both their immediate utility and long-term market value. This created a highly nuanced economic ecosystem, where origin, age, skill, and health intersected to determine the cost of a single human being. The economic consequences of Rome's conquests were multifaceted. Military campaigns not only expanded territory and resources, but also flooded the labor market with slaves, thereby linking imperial ambition directly to domestic economic conditions. Victorious generals often profited by selling captives, while local magistrates and wealthy elites acquired laborers for estates, workshops, and households. The sudden availability of large numbers of slaves could depress prices for ordinary labor, but enhance value for skilled or exotic individuals. Conversely, periods of peace or decline in military activity often resulted in scarcity, elevating the cost of acquisition and making the careful management of existing slaves all the more critical. This intimate connection between geopolitical events and market dynamics illustrates the way in which slavery in Rome was not merely a social institution, but an economic engine intertwined with broader patterns of conquest, diplomacy, and territorial administration. Within households and urban centers, the origin of a slave could affect more than just the purchase price. Those raised within Roman culture, or already familiar with domestic tasks, were often immediately useful, and therefore highly sought after. Conversely, newly captured foreigners might require training, adaptation, or oversight, which introduced an additional cost in time and management. The skill of the individual, combined with their health, temperament, and familiarity with Roman norms, created a multifactorial approach to valuation that was both practical and reflective of social hierarchies. Even children born into slavery were considered future investments, their price reflecting the anticipated labor and social adaptation they would provide over years or decades. The integration of war, piracy, debt, and birth into the slave market demonstrates the complexity of the Roman system. It was not simply a matter of purchasing labor, but of navigating a constantly shifting network of supply, demand, and human attributes. The economic consequences of each source of slaves affected prices, availability, and social perceptions, while also influencing decisions about training, deployment, and eventual manumission. Within this environment, the calculation of value was continuous, subtle, and informed by both immediate needs and long-term planning, echoing the broader rhythms of the Roman economy, where every movement of goods, people, and capital was carefully observed and assessed. As these mechanisms of acquisition continued to shape the supply of slaves, they set the stage for a detailed consideration of the legal frameworks and ownership rights that governed the treatment, valuation, and sale of human beings. For it was not only the origin of slaves, but also the structures of law and custom that determined how their worth was calculated, negotiated, and ultimately realized in Roman markets. As the origins and acquisition of slaves shaped the supply within the Roman economy, it was the structures of law and custom that framed the human and economic relationships surrounding them. Roman society was deeply legalistic, and the ownership, treatment, and transaction of slaves were embedded in codified rules and societal norms. While the enslaved were not considered citizens or legal persons, their status as property was clearly defined, and the laws surrounding them had a profound effect on their market value, their deployment in households and estates, and the responsibilities of their owners. The Roman legal framework, evolving over centuries, created a systematic environment in which the economic worth of a slave could be assessed with precision, linking law, social hierarchy, and commerce in ways both subtle and pervasive. The Roman concept of ownership was central to understanding the legal status of slaves. Slaves were defined as res, or property, in Roman law, and their owners, known as domini, possessed virtually complete control over them. This ownership included the right to sell, lease, transfer, or bequeath slaves, as well as the authority to use their labor in any manner deemed beneficial. However, ownership was not absolute in all respects. Roman law imposed certain limitations and expectations regarding treatment, discipline and the potential for manumission. The legal codification of these rights and responsibilities provided stability to the market, ensuring that transactions were recognized, disputes could be adjudicated, and the value of slaves could be calculated with reference to established standards. Buyers and sellers relied on these laws to guide negotiation, assessment, and investment, creating a structured marketplace that was inseparable from the broader legal system. One of the key legal mechanisms that influenced the valuation of slaves was the peculium, a form of private property that could be allocated to slaves for their management. While slaves themselves were legally owned, they could hold and manage money, goods, or even small business operations under the supervision of their master. This allocation of responsibility and the potential for profit or skill development increased the utility of certain slaves, and therefore their market value. A slave capable of managing a workshop, running a shop, or tending to complex financial matters could command higher prices precisely because the law recognized their potential for productive activity under the master's authority. This intersection of law and economics illustrates how legal definitions extended beyond mere possession, affecting both immediate labor utility and long-term investment potential. Transactions involving slaves were also strictly regulated, and legal mechanisms ensured that buyers could secure recourse if disputes arose. Contracts, sales agreements, and public auctions were recognized and enforceable under Roman law, which codified both the rights of owners and the obligations of sellers. For instance, sellers were often expected to disclose defects, illnesses, or behavioral issues, and failure to do so could result in legal action. Similarly, buyers could inspect slaves and assess their condition before completing a purchase, and certain guarantees or warranties might be included in contracts to account for age, health, or training. These legal frameworks provided a measure of predictability to the market, allowing prices to reflect not only the physical and skill-based qualities of slaves, but also the contractual assurances that accompanied them. The codification of these processes ensured that the valuation of human labor was not arbitrary but guided by recognized standards, contributing to the perception of fairness, stability, and legitimacy in the marketplace. Roman law also acknowledged distinctions between different categories of slaves, further influencing market valuation. Slaves acquired through war, piracy, or debt might carry different legal implications depending on origin, citizenship of the captives, or the context of acquisition. Some laws governed the treatment of slaves captured from Roman allies or from territories under certain treaties, imposing limitations on sale or transfer. Similarly, slaves born within a household or estate were subject to specific legal expectations regarding inheritance, family structure, and continuity of labor. These legal distinctions were carefully noted in market transactions as they could significantly affect price, utility, and risk assessment. A slave whose legal status was well defined and secure might be more valuable than one whose origins or documentation were ambiguous, illustrating the intimate link between law and commerce in the valuation process. Ownership also carried responsibilities that could influence long-term economic calculations. Masters were expected to provide basic sustenance, shelter, and oversight, ensuring that slaves remained healthy and productive. Neglect or abuse could reduce efficiency, shorten lifespan, or even lead to legal consequences if extreme conditions violated social or legal norms. Thus, the cost of a slave extended beyond the initial purchase price to include ongoing maintenance, regulated in part by customary and legal expectations. The awareness of these obligations shaped both buying decisions and the broader market dynamics, with well-cared-for slaves often commanding higher prices due to their reliability and lower risk of illness, escape, or reduced productivity. The legal frameworks also encompassed manumission, the process by which slaves could be freed. While not guaranteed, manumission was a recognized and regulated aspect of Roman law, with procedures that allowed owners to grant freedom formally, often in exchange for service, loyalty, or financial compensation. The possibility of future manumission influenced both the behavior and the perceived value of slaves. Those considered reliable, skilled, or loyal might be seen as more valuable, not only for their immediate labor, but for the potential social and economic benefits their eventual freedom might confer, whether in the form of continued trade, loyalty, or familial connections. The integration of these legal pathways into the marketplace highlights how law shaped perception and price, intertwining economic, social, and moral considerations in complex ways. Furthermore, Roman law recognized distinctions in the treatment of slaves according to occupation and skill. Household attendants, artisans, educators, and entertainers were subject to different legal considerations than agricultural laborers or mine workers. Skilled slaves might have contracts specifying their training, expected productivity, or even limitations on use outside certain roles. These legal distinctions reinforced the stratification of the market, ensuring that pricing reflected not only the basic utility of labor, but also the specialized skills and legal expectations associated with various categories of slaves. Such stratification was deeply entwined with social norms, as owners sought to maximize economic efficiency while maintaining compliance with legal and customary standards. The intertwining of legal codes and economic realities created a marketplace in which value was multidimensional, encompassing physical ability, skill, age, origin, legal status, and potential future productivity. Buyers and sellers navigated a network of norms and regulations that provided structure and predictability, allowing the pricing of human lives to be approached systematically, if morally disquietingly, within the context of Roman society. The constant evaluation of these factors ensured that the economy could function efficiently, linking law, commerce, and social hierarchy in a manner that reinforced both order and profitability. As the legal framework set the boundaries within which slaves were bought, sold, and utilized, it also established the conditions under which different types of labor could be valued and differentiated. This naturally leads to a more detailed examination of the types of slaves and their valuation, for within the legal and economic system, the nature of the labor performed by a slave, whether domestic, agricultural, skilled, or entertaining, shaped not only the price but the perceived utility and desirability in Roman society. Within the structured legal and economic framework of Rome, the nature of a slave's work was one of the primary determinants of their market value. The city, countryside, and distant provinces contained a variety of labor demands, each shaping the type of slaves acquired, trained, and utilized. Slavery in Rome was not a monolithic institution. It encompassed a spectrum of roles, from menial domestic service to highly specialized craftsmanship, from the grueling physical demands of agricultural labor to the performative spectacle of the arena. The differentiation of roles had profound implications for pricing, as the skills, physical attributes, and potential utility of a slave were meticulously evaluated within the marketplace, reflecting both economic necessity and social prestige. At the heart of Roman urban households were domestic slaves, often referred to as familia urbana. These individuals performed a wide range of tasks, including cooking, cleaning, tending to children, fetching water, maintaining the household, and assisting in the management of day-to-day affairs. Within the city, where domestic comfort and social appearances were highly prized, these slaves were indispensable. Their value was influenced not only by physical ability, but also by temperament, reliability, and sometimes education. A domestic slave with literacy skills, capable of reading, writing, or maintaining accounts, could command a higher price than one suited only for menial chores. The integration of domestic labor into social and economic life meant that these slaves were visible markers of wealth and organization, and their valuation reflected both practical utility and symbolic prestige within Roman society. In contrast, agricultural laborers, often known as familia rustica, were essential to the production of food and raw materials that sustained the city and the empire. Large estates, or latifundia, relied heavily on these laborers to cultivate grain, olives, grapes, and other crops across vast expanses of land. The value of agricultural slaves was closely tied to physical strength, endurance, and health. A robust, healthy individual, capable of long hours in the fields, was an economic asset, whose productivity could be calculated in terms of yield, efficiency, and potential profit for the owner. Unlike domestic slaves, agricultural laborers were less visible in urban society, but were critical to the maintenance of wealth, feeding not only households but also the urban population, the military, and trade networks. The price of these slaves could fluctuate with seasonal demands, harvest expectations, and regional availability, reflecting a dynamic and context-sensitive valuation system. Skilled artisans occupied a distinctive niche within the Roman economy. These included carpenters, blacksmiths, potters, weavers, and other craftsmen, whose expertise contributed directly to production, trade, and revenue generation. Artisans were often trained, sometimes from childhood, in specific techniques that could take years to master. A slave with such skills represented both immediate labor and the long-term investment of knowledge and technique, commanding a price significantly higher than unskilled laborers. Artisans were sometimes allowed a degree of autonomy to manage workshops or produce goods for profit, under supervision or contractual agreements known as peculium. Their market value was thus influenced not only by physical capability, but also by mastery, reliability, and potential for generating income. Owners recognized that the cost of such slaves was offset by the quality, quantity, and marketability of the goods they produced. The arena, a central feature of Roman entertainment and social life, introduced a unique category: gladiators. These slaves, often captured in war, or purchased specifically for combat, were trained in martial skills and physical conditioning designed for public spectacle. The value of a gladiator was determined by physical prowess, skill with weapons, endurance, and importantly appearance and charisma, which could attract larger audiences and greater revenue. Age and health were consistently intertwined with role and valuation. Younger, robust individuals, capable of years of productive labor, were typically more expensive than older or physically impaired slaves. For domestic or skilled roles, the ability to learn, adapt, and maintain reliability over time further enhanced value. In contrast, those with infirmities, poor health, or advanced age were priced lower, reflecting shorter expected utility and higher maintenance costs. This careful assessment of physical condition and potential output illustrates the Roman approach to slavery as an economic as well as social institution, where each individual's attributes were meticulously appraised to determine appropriate market value. Regional origin also influenced valuation within these types of roles. Slaves captured or imported from distant provinces could carry a premium, either due to exotic appeal, perceived physical or mental attributes, or the social prestige associated with owning someone from a far-off land. Artisans from specific regions known for particular crafts, or gladiators trained in distinctive styles of combat, could command higher prices than those locally available. Conversely, oversaturation in certain regions could depress prices, particularly for standard agricultural or domestic labor, reflecting the interplay of supply, demand, and cultural perception across the empire. This differentiation of types, skills, and roles created a stratified market in which buyers and sellers had to navigate a complex set of criteria. Household, agricultural, skilled, and entertainment roles were not merely economic categories, but reflected broader societal values, cultural expectations, and practical necessities. The market for slaves was therefore highly dynamic, responsive to both immediate utility and long-term investment potential, influenced by legal protections, social norms, and the fluctuating rhythms of conquest, trade, and urban life. As the differentiation of slaves by role, skill, and utility shaped their market value, it naturally leads to a closer examination of how age, physical condition, and gender further influenced pricing, adding yet another layer of calculation and perception in the complex economic ecosystem of Roman slavery. As the Roman marketplace evaluated the types and skills of slaves, another crucial dimension shaped their economic value: age and physical condition. Within the intricate web of commerce, law, and social perception, youth and strength were more than mere attributes. They were measures of potential productivity, durability, and the expected duration of service. Roman buyers and sellers assessed these factors carefully, understanding that the long-term utility of a slave could often outweigh immediate labor output. Age in particular provided a predictable indicator of both physical capability and investment horizon, guiding pricing and negotiation in markets that stretched from the heart of the city to distant provincial towns. Young adults, typically in their late teens or early 20s, were considered the most valuable in most labor categories. Their strength, endurance, and relative health made them ideal for agricultural work, construction, and physically demanding household tasks. In urban settings, domestic slaves of this age were expected to maintain energy, adapt quickly to the complex needs of households, and contribute to the smooth operation of daily life. Similarly, in workshops or artisan settings, younger slaves could endure the long hours of craft training, demonstrating skill over years that would yield consistent and reliable output. But the market recognized that a young, healthy individual represented a long-term asset, often justifying higher prices than older slaves who, while experienced, had fewer productive years ahead. Physical condition complemented age as a key determinant of value. Robust, healthy slaves commanded higher prices because they were less prone to illness, injury, or early death, and thus promised sustained productivity. Buyers assessed posture, musculature, and overall vitality, often relying on visual inspection and practical tests to determine strength and agility. In domestic settings, physical health ensured the ability to carry out daily tasks efficiently. In agriculture or workshops, it meant endurance and resilience under demanding conditions. A physically fit slave could be expected to perform consistently, reducing the need for replacement and minimizing interruptions in labor, both of which translated into higher economic value. Conversely, visible signs of frailty, chronic illness, or injury lowered market price, reflecting the anticipated costs of care, potential inability to perform or shorter duration of productive labor. Youth also intersected with long-term planning in households and estates. Owners recognized that investing in younger slaves allowed them to shape training, habits, and skills from an early age, ensuring that the individual could be integrated fully into the labor and social structure of the household. For artisans or domestic attendants, starting with younger slaves meant fewer ingrained habits to overcome and a greater opportunity to cultivate loyalty and reliability. In agricultural settings, young laborers could endure the seasonal cycles of planting, tending, and harvesting over many years, providing consistent output and reducing the risks associated with short-term labor acquisition. Age, therefore, was not simply an indicator of immediate utility, but a factor in multi-year economic planning, influencing both initial purchase price and anticipated return on investment. In certain contexts, physical attractiveness added yet another dimension to value. This was particularly relevant for household slaves, entertainers, and those in roles requiring social interaction, such as attendants or concubines. Roman society, while deeply pragmatic in economic matters, also placed importance on appearance in domestic, cultural, and ceremonial contexts. A young, attractive slave could enhance the social prestige of a household, contribute to the cultural ambiance of an estate, or participate in public events with visual appeal. This form of valuation, while less directly tied to labor output, reflected the broader understanding of utility in Roman society, where social impression, reputation, and aesthetic considerations could influence economic decisions. Age-related valuation extended across gender, with distinct considerations for male and female slaves. Young males, particularly those with physical strength, were highly valued for agricultural work, construction, and combat-related roles, such as gladiators or guards. Young females, especially those capable of domestic labor, weaving, cooking, or childcare, could command higher prices due to versatility, productivity, and long-term utility within the household. In both cases, the combination of youth, health, and skills created a premium in the marketplace, emphasizing how intertwined demographic attributes were with economic valuation. Older slaves, while often experienced, were typically priced lower because their potential for long-term contribution was diminished, even if their expertise offered some compensatory value. The life cycle of a slave also influenced pricing strategies. Children, often born into slavery, were valued for their potential rather than immediate labor. Prices for young children were lower than adults, but reflected the anticipated investment in training and care, with the understanding that these individuals would eventually provide sustained labor over many years. Adolescents approaching adulthood, already physically capable and beginning to learn skills, occupied a transitional valuation space, balancing the lower cost of youth with emerging utility. Following the assessment of age and physical condition, the Roman marketplace further distinguished value according to gender, assigning economic significance to roles traditionally associated with men and women. Gender, within the context of Roman slavery, was inseparable from labor expectations, social function, and cultural perception, and it exerted a subtle yet pervasive influence on market valuation. Male and female slaves were evaluated not only for physical capability or skill, but also for the ways in which their gendered roles contributed to household, agricultural, or urban economy. Understanding these distinctions provides insight into how Roman society integrated social norms with the practicalities of labor and the imperatives of commerce. Male slaves were often primarily valued for their capacity for physical labor, endurance, and skill in specialized tasks. In agriculture, strong young men could till fields, harvest grain, tend to livestock, and perform the heavy lifting necessary to sustain both rural estates and urban markets. Construction projects, whether for private villas or public works, relied heavily on male laborers who could handle stone, timber, and metal work. Even within households, male slaves were often assigned tasks requiring strength, such as carrying water, moving furniture, guarding property, or supervising other slaves. The economic value of men in these roles was often calculated with reference to anticipated productivity over a span of years, physical resilience, and the capacity to endure rigorous schedules. Buyers and sellers paid close attention to stature, musculature, and health, understanding that the ability to work efficiently over long periods was a primary determinant of price. In contrast, female slaves were predominantly associated with domestic tasks, child-rearing, and companionship, though there were exceptions in specialized crafts or entertainment. Within the urban household, women performed cooking, cleaning, weaving, and clothing production, all of which were vital to maintaining the household's daily functioning. They were also responsible for tending to children, elderly family members, and sometimes the management of the household staff. The market valued these skills highly, as the effective functioning of a household depended on reliability, competence, and adaptability. Female slaves with literacy, sewing ability, or expertise in managing domestic finances could command a higher price than those with purely menial skills, reflecting the dual role of women as both laborers and facilitators of household efficiency. Companionship and social roles further differentiated female slaves, adding a layer of valuation tied to aesthetics, demeanor, and social presentation. In wealthy households, women might be expected to participate in ceremonial functions, host or attend gatherings, and enhance the family's public image through their presence, decorum, or appearance. In some cases, attractive young women were valued not only for domestic labor, but also for potential intimate companionship, which, while morally complex and socially embedded in Roman norms, influenced market price. The interplay of domestic labor, social function, and aesthetic appeal meant that female slaves could be appraised along multiple axes of value, combining practical utility with social and symbolic significance. The comparison between male and female valuation illustrates how Roman buyers and sellers integrated social expectations with economic assessment. Men's value tended to align with direct physical productivity, while women's value incorporated both functional labor and supplementary social or symbolic contributions. Yet, both genders could experience price fluctuations based on skills, health, age, and origin, demonstrating that gender alone was not a singular determinant, but part of a broader matrix of characteristics shaping market assessment. Buyers often considered combinations of attributes, physical capability, age, skills, temperament, and gender when negotiating price, reflecting the multidimensional calculus employed in Roman slave markets. Certain roles created exceptions to typical gendered patterns. Skilled female artisans or entertainers, for example, might command prices comparable to male counterparts due to their specialized abilities. Female performers in music, dance, or theatre were highly valued for their contribution to social events and public spectacles. Similarly, male slaves trained in skilled trades, education, or medical practice could attain higher prices than typical agricultural laborers, reflecting the nuanced consideration of skill and economic potential beyond simple physical capability. These variations highlight the flexible but socially structured nature of valuation, in which gender set general expectations but did not rigidly constrain market assessment. Regional and cultural factors also intersected with gender-based valuation. Women or men from distant provinces might carry a premium due to perceived exotic qualities or distinctive physical attributes. Roman buyers considered not only practical ability, but also the symbolic value of owning slaves from specific regions, reinforcing social prestige or differentiating households. In certain contexts, a female slave from a particular province known for domestic expertise or aesthetic traits could command a higher price than a locally sourced individual. Likewise, male laborers or artisans from regions reputed for strength, endurance, or technical skill were often valued above locally available counterparts. Integrating gender, skill, and origin into a complex pricing structure. Gendered valuation also had implications for long-term planning and labor management. Male slaves, expected to provide physical labor for years, were often purchased with durability in mind, while female slaves, whose labor included domestic management and potentially childbirth, were considered valuable over both immediate and extended time frames. The reproductive potential of female slaves further influenced market decisions, as children born into slavery augmented the labor supply within households and estates. Buyers and owners factored these long-term contributions into initial purchase price and ongoing economic calculations, recognizing that gendered roles extended beyond individual labor to intergenerational utility. Finally, gender influenced not only economic calculations but also social and household dynamics. Owners structured work, training, and supervision according to expectations of male and female performance, reinforcing societal norms while maximizing economic efficiency. These gendered distinctions were thus embedded in both market valuation and daily life, shaping the experience of slavery and the broader social fabric. Male and female slaves were integrated into households and estates according to complementary roles, creating an interconnected labor system where valuation reflected productivity, skill, and social function in a cohesive manner. As gender shaped valuation through labor expectations, social roles, and symbolic utility, it naturally leads to a consideration of regional and cultural origin in slave pricing, for the perception of value in Rome was influenced not only by skill, age, or gender, but also by the geographic and ethnic background of the enslaved individuals, adding yet another layer to economic assessment in this complex marketplace. Alongside gender and age, the presence of specific skills became one of the most significant determinants of a slave's value in Roman society. Beyond the general distinctions between domestic, agricultural, and entertainment roles, Roman buyers and sellers placed substantial emphasis on literacy, craftsmanship, and specialized trade abilities. These skills were not merely practical, they represented an investment in productive capacity, efficiency, and potential revenue. A slave's ability to perform complex tasks could dramatically elevate their market price, reflecting the economy's recognition of talent and utility within a system that otherwise treated human beings as property. Literacy was a particularly valued skill, especially in urban households and administrative centers. Slaves who could read, write, and maintain records were indispensable in managing finances, correspondence, and documentation. Educated slaves might serve as secretaries, scribes, or accountants, recording transactions, managing inventories, and facilitating communication across estates or businesses. In some instances, these literate slaves were entrusted with sensitive tasks, including negotiating contracts or overseeing subordinate laborers. The combination of intellectual ability, reliability, and trustworthiness made such individuals highly prized in Roman markets. Buyers understood that the investment in a literate slave could yield returns not only through labor, but also through efficiency, accuracy, and the reduction of errors in management or trade, creating a practical and economic premium. Craftsmanship and trade skills further enhanced valuation, particularly for slaves employed in artisan workshops or skilled labor sectors. Carpenters, Blacksmiths, potters, stonemasons, weavers, and other specialists possessed expertise that required years of practice and instruction. Such slaves could contribute directly to income generation, whether by producing goods for sale, maintaining infrastructure, or supporting large-scale construction projects. The economic rationale was clear: a skilled artisan could produce more, better, and more efficiently than untrained laborers, justifying higher purchase prices. Owners often evaluated the quality of prior work, the refinement of technique, and the potential for teaching or supervising others when determining value, emphasizing the multifaceted nature of skilled labor assessment. In addition to practical output, specialized knowledge could create scarcity-driven premiums. For example, slaves trained in specific artistic or technical disciplines, such as mosaic work, glassblowing, or metal engraving, were relatively rare and difficult to replace. Buyers were willing to pay higher prices for these individuals because their skills could not be readily replicated, offering both immediate utility and long-term economic advantage. Similarly, slaves with expertise in culinary arts, medicine, or educational instruction held considerable market value. Their abilities not only facilitated household management, but also enhanced social status, making them highly desirable to affluent families seeking both service and prestige. Training and experience also played an important role in pricing. A slave who had completed a lengthy apprenticeship or been previously employed in a specialized function could command higher prices due to demonstrated competence and reduced risk. For instance, an artisan who had successfully produced fine pottery for years required less supervision and was less likely to produce defective work, making their labor more economically reliable. The evaluation of such experience involved not only physical inspection or demonstration, but also references, social reputation, and known associations with prior owners or workshops. This created a system of informal credentialing, whereby skill and reputation translated directly into market value. Even within domestic settings, specialized skills increased a slave's price. Those capable of managing finances, overseeing other slaves, or maintaining complex household operations were particularly valuable. The economic impact was twofold. First, the owner could rely on efficiency and accuracy in daily operations, and second, these slaves often allowed the household to operate at a higher standard, indirectly influencing social prestige and the ability to attract advantageous relationships or contracts. Literate and administratively skilled slaves were sometimes entrusted with delicate correspondence or legal matters, and the perceived trustworthiness of the individual further elevated their value, intertwining skill, responsibility, and social capital in determining price. In urban marketplaces, skill levels were often advertised and considered explicitly during transactions. Auction records, historical accounts, and legal documents indicate that buyers carefully inquired about a slave's abilities, prior experience, and potential for productivity. Slaves who could perform specialized trades were sometimes evaluated through demonstration, showing their handiwork, calculating efficiency, or providing evidence of training. This transparency allowed prices to reflect an objective assessment of potential economic contribution, reinforcing the notion that skills were a premium factor in valuation. Certain highly skilled professions, due to their rarity and profitability, were particularly valued. Gladiators trained in complex combat techniques, musicians or performers adept in multiple instruments or dramatic arts, and artisans capable of producing high-quality or luxury goods, were all priced according to their unique abilities and expected income generation. In these cases, skill not only ensured productivity, but could also elevate the owner's social and economic position, as possessing such slaves signaled wealth, sophistication, and access to scarce talent. The market recognized both the practical and symbolic significance of skill, translating these attributes into quantifiable economic value. Trade-specific knowledge could also impact resale potential. A slave with skills applicable across multiple households, workshops, or estates represented a liquid asset, likely to retain value over time. Buyers factored in the ease of transfer, adaptability, and market demand when pricing these individuals. Conversely, highly specialized skills with limited applicability could restrict mobility and reduce liquidity, slightly lowering price, but often still maintaining high value within niche contexts. This demonstrates how skill-based valuation was nuanced, reflecting a careful assessment of both current productivity and future economic potential. Ultimately, the assessment of skill levels underscores the sophisticated, multi-layered nature of Roman slave markets. Skills, literacy, craftsmanship, and trade abilities intersected with age, gender, origin, and physical condition to create a multi-dimensional calculus of value. Each factor contributed to the perception of utility, productivity, and social worth, shaping the marketplace into a finely tuned system in which human labor was systematically evaluated, stratified, and priced according to potential contribution, both practical and symbolic. As skill levels influenced pricing and economic utility, it naturally transitions into an examination of how origin and cultural background affected valuation. For the geographic and ethnic origins of a slave were often intertwined with perceived abilities, social prestige, and scarcity, further refining the complex system of assessment that characterized the Roman slave economy. As skill, age, and gender shaped the valuation of slaves, another crucial determinant emerged in the complex calculus of the Roman marketplace: regional origin and the geographical context of trade. Prices were not uniform across the empire. Rather, they fluctuated according to local supply and demand, proximity to sources of captives, economic conditions, and the relative wealth of buyers in urban versus rural settings. The Roman economy, vast and interconnected, operated through a network of markets that reflected the diversity of the empire's geography, population, and labor needs, producing variations in the cost of slaves that were both practical and socially meaningful. Within the city of Rome itself, where the concentration of wealthy households, workshops, and entertainment venues created a high demand for domestic, skilled, and performative labor, prices were often elevated. Buyers in the urban center required individuals capable of sustaining complex households, managing finances, entertaining guests, and performing specialized crafts. The density of wealthy citizens created a competitive environment for acquiring desirable slaves, particularly those with literacy, skill, or physical appeal. Domestic slaves, literate scribes, trained artisans, and entertainers were highly sought after in the capital, and scarcity within the city itself often led to premium pricing. The value of a slave in Rome thus reflected not only their individual attributes, but also the intensity of demand in the metropolitan environment. In Italy outside the city, market dynamics were slightly different. Rural towns and agricultural estates relied heavily on laborers capable of sustaining production in fields, vineyards, and olive groves. While domestic and skilled labor was still important, the bulk of demand centered on physically capable individuals who could work the land efficiently. Consequently, agricultural laborers and unskilled workers were generally more affordable than their urban counterparts, reflecting the lower competition for such individuals and the abundant supply of captives from local and provincial sources. At the same time, estates in prosperous regions might still pay higher prices for domestic or specialized labor, particularly when attempting to replicate urban standards of comfort and household management. Beyond Italy, the provinces presented a distinct set of considerations. In regions such as Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, or the Eastern Mediterranean, slave prices were influenced by local conquest patterns, the availability of captives, and regional economic structures. For example, territories recently subdued through military campaigns produced a surplus of war captives, often depressing prices locally due to increased supply. Conversely, in areas where conquest was less frequent or trade networks were more limited, the scarcity of skilled or able-bodied slaves could elevate prices, reflecting the difficulty of acquisition. These regional variations demonstrate the sensitivity of the market to supply conditions, illustrating how the Roman economy responded fluidly to geopolitical developments and local labor dynamics. Urban versus rural markets also displayed pronounced differences. Cities, whether Rome, Alexandria, or Carthage, demanded labor that combined skill, reliability, and appearance, often raising prices above comparable individuals in rural areas. Rural estates, particularly those engaged in large-scale agriculture, were more concerned with endurance, strength and productivity, allowing owners to select slaves who could perform physically demanding labor at lower cost. Market fluctuations in these areas were affected not only by local production needs, but also by transportation, logistical considerations and regional availability. Moving a slave from a provincial market to the capital, for example, involved additional expense, risk and time, which could be reflected in higher urban prices. The distribution of slaves throughout the empire thus created a geographically sensitive pricing system, responsive to both immediate labor needs and broader economic realities. Cultural perceptions associated with regional origin further influenced valuation. Slaves from particular areas were often thought to possess certain desirable attributes. For example, captives from regions known for military prowess or physical strength were sometimes preferred for labor-intensive tasks, while those from areas famed for education, artistry, or sophistication were highly valued in households and urban environments. These perceptions could augment or diminish price independently of skill, age, or health, reflecting the social and symbolic dimensions of origin alongside practical utility. The interplay of geography, cultural expectation, and perceived capability created subtle yet impactful variations in valuation across the empire. Transportation and logistics also played a role in regional pricing. Slaves captured in distant provinces or imported through trade networks required movement over long distances, often involving significant costs and risks. Maritime routes, caravans and land transport presented possibilities of delay, illness or mortality, which buyers accounted for in pricing. The closer a market was to the source of supply, the lower these logistical costs, allowing for more competitive prices. Conversely, in distant urban centers where demand was high but supply limited, transport considerations contributed to elevated pricing, reflecting both economic calculation and the practical realities of empire-wide distribution. Additionally, regional economic conditions shaped the purchasing power of buyers, indirectly affecting the market. Affluent urban areas with dense populations of wealthy households and commercial enterprises could support higher prices, while rural or economically depressed regions offered lower compensation due to limited financial capacity. Seasonal fluctuations, local harvest yields, and ongoing political stability further influenced local market dynamics, producing variations in slave cost that were responsive to both macroeconomic and microeconomic conditions. The Roman system, while sophisticated, was highly sensitive to regional and temporal fluctuations, ensuring that price was never a fixed quantity, but an adaptive measure of value based on location, supply, and demand. In summary, regional differences in slave costs were a product of intertwined factors: the concentration of demand, the proximity to supply, transportation logistics, local economic conditions and cultural perceptions of origin. Buyers and sellers navigated these variables carefully, understanding that the same individual could command widely varying prices depending on where, when, and in what context they were sold. Regional context was thus inseparable from assessment, shaping valuation as much as skill, age, or gender, and illustrating the complexity of Roman economic thinking regarding human property. As regional differences influenced market price and perception, it naturally leads to an exploration of market fluctuations and the effects of war, conquest, and political instability on slave pricing. For these large-scale events created shifts in supply and demand that reverberated across Rome, Italy, and the provinces, altering the economic landscape in which slaves were valued. As regional differences and macroeconomic factors influenced the valuation of slaves, these abstract calculations materialized in the bustling and often overwhelming environment of the Roman slave market. The marketplace was a convergence of commerce, social interaction, and ritualized negotiation, where the previously discussed attributes of age, gender, skill, and origin were translated into tangible prices through sight, speech, and subtle cues. Entering the market, one encountered a space that was at once structured and chaotic, its sensory impressions shaping both the perception of value and the behavior of buyers, sellers, and slaves themselves. Roman slave markets were typically held in urban centers, along busy streets, in forum spaces, or within designated marketplaces. The setting was practical, designed to accommodate large numbers of people and the physical display of captives, yet it carried a social dimension, functioning as a public stage for the assertion of wealth, status, and control. Buyers ranging from affluent householders to estate managers and merchants moved through these spaces with careful attention, evaluating potential acquisitions according to the criteria previously outlined. Sellers, often professional traders or brokers, presented slaves in ways intended to highlight strength, skill, appearance, and temperament. The negotiation process was highly ritualized, balancing the needs of the market with the expectations of transparency, credibility, and mutual understanding among participants. The sensory experience of a Roman slave market was rich and layered. One could hear the cacophony of voices as buyers inquired about age, origin, skills, and health, while sellers extolled the virtues of their human property. Discussions of price were frequent, punctuated by haggling, offers, counter-offers, and occasional displays of temper or persuasion. Slaves themselves, bound or displayed on raised platforms, were often inspected physically by potential buyers, who tested strength, agility, and responsiveness. In some instances, particularly for skilled laborers or artisans, demonstrations of ability were arranged, allowing buyers to assess craftsmanship, literacy, or performative talent directly. Visual assessment was critical, but so too were impressions of demeanor, obedience, and adaptability, each contributing to the nuanced calculation of economic value. Smell and atmosphere contributed to the immersive quality of these markets. The mingling of animals, dust from the streets or rural transport, sweat from laborers and captives, and the sense of food and urban life created a dense and unmistakable environment. Buyers and sellers navigated these conditions with practiced efficiency, often accustomed to the olfactory, visual, and auditory stimuli that accompanied large-scale transactions. Within this environment, the presence of other buyers and social observers reinforced the performative aspect of the market. Displaying discernment, skill in negotiation, or visible wealth served as a social signal, augmenting one's standing and facilitating advantageous transactions. The process of pricing and negotiation in these markets followed customary protocols. Initial assessments were conducted with attention to the attributes of the individual slave, physical, intellectual, and social, after which buyers would make offers reflecting perceived utility and market conditions. Sellers might quote a base price while anticipating negotiation, or adjust pricing based on current demand, scarcity of similar slaves, and regional fluctuations. Auctions, both formal and informal, allowed multiple buyers to compete, sometimes driving prices higher through visible bidding. Private transactions often required subtle negotiation, leveraging information about prior ownership, demonstrated skill or reputation to arrive at mutually acceptable terms. Throughout these processes, knowledge of the market, experience with previous sales, and social intelligence were as crucial as the physical inspection of the slaves themselves. The presence of intermediaries, such as slave brokers or agents, added another dimension. These individuals facilitated communication, arranged transport, and provided assurances regarding health, skill, or origin. Brokers often had detailed knowledge of pricing trends, regional conditions, and the relative desirability of specific types of labor, and their advice could shape buyer decisions significantly. Their role highlighted the professionalization of the market and the degree to which economic expertise intersected with social practice in Roman society. The brokered sale exemplified a controlled yet flexible negotiation system in which information, presentation, and perception all contributed to final price determination. Sensory and social factors also interacted with broader cultural expectations. Slaves were not merely commodities but symbols of wealth, status, and household capability. Their presentation at the market conveyed messages to observers about their potential utility, the sophistication of the owner or buyer, and the alignment of social norms with economic practice. For instance, a literate domestic slave presented in a clean, well-groomed manner signaled refinement, reliability, and suitability for urban household management. an agricultural laborer or robust male from a distant province, displayed in conditions emphasizing physical strength and endurance, conveyed utility in a tangible, immediate way. These visual cues, combined with oral description, negotiation, and demonstration, structured the marketplace as a complex interplay of material assessment, social signaling, and economic calculation. Markets also provided a point of convergence for economic and ethical considerations, reflecting the moral ambivalence inherent in Roman slavery. While buyers focused on productivity and potential, the human presence of the enslaved individual was unavoidable. Observing demeanor, responsiveness, and vulnerability influenced perceptions, even within the highly pragmatic framework of trade. Slaves' ability to attract favorable assessment through health, skill, or comportment could thus directly impact market value, illustrating the intersection of human behavior, societal norms, and economic imperatives in Roman commerce. Moreover, the experience of the marketplace was temporally dynamic. Seasonal fluctuations, political events, and military campaigns influenced supply, demand, and pricing, creating a rhythm to market activity. During periods following conquest, when captives were abundant, prices might temporarily decline, whereas scarcity could elevate value. Buyers, aware of these temporal dynamics, timed purchases strategically, weighing immediate need against potential future advantage. These cyclical variations reinforced the market's responsiveness to external conditions, integrating the marketplace into the broader economic and social structure of the empire. In essence, the Roman slave market was a microcosm of the empire itself, a space where economics, social norms, sensory experience, and practical assessment converged in a carefully orchestrated yet fluid system. The pricing rituals, negotiation customs, and physical display of human labor reflected a highly structured approach to valuation, in which age, gender, skill, origin, and health were translated into tangible economic terms. Within this marketplace, theoretical attributes became practical reality, and abstract assessments of worth were crystallized through sight, touch, sound, and interaction, producing a living, breathing economy of human property. As the sensory, social, and procedural elements of the slave market shaped immediate pricing, it naturally leads to an exploration of the impact of political instability, war, and conquest on supply and demand. For these macro-level factors determined both the availability of slaves and the fluctuations of their market value across time and space. Beyond the structured environment of the marketplaces and the careful evaluation of individual attributes, the broader geopolitical context of Rome exerted a profound influence on the price of slaves. War, conquest, and the influx of prisoners were central drivers of supply, shaping not only availability, but also perceived value across regions and markets. The Roman economy, intimately tied to military expansion, experienced periods in which the consequences of conquest resonated in the form of human property entering the marketplace, with prices fluctuating in response to both abundance and scarcity. Understanding the interplay between military activity and economic valuation reveals how external political and social forces were inseparable from the microeconomics of slavery. During periods of military success, the capture of prisoners of war often resulted in a sudden and substantial increase in the supply of slaves. Large-scale campaigns across the Mediterranean, from Gaul to Hispania, the Balkans and the eastern provinces, produced thousands of captives who were subsequently sold in markets across the empire. These influxes typically led to short-term reductions in price, as the abundance of available labor exceeded immediate demand. Estates, households, and urban buyers could acquire slaves at lower cost, and sellers had to adjust expectations to reflect the saturated market. The sheer volume of captives, often transported over long distances, introduced logistical challenges, but the basic principle remained: increased supply led to downward pressure on market prices. Yet this effect was not uniform or permanent. While large numbers of captives could depress prices temporarily, the quality, skill, and origin of these individuals influenced market dynamics in complex ways. Young, healthy, skilled, or aesthetically desirable captives could still command relatively high prices despite the overall abundance. Additionally, as these newly acquired slaves were distributed from ports to urban centers or rural estates. Transportation, mortality during transit, and the costs associated with handling and preparation could mitigate the downward pressure of supply, maintaining higher values in certain contexts. The interaction between raw supply, perceived utility, and practical considerations created a nuanced economic environment responsive to the specifics of military conquest and subsequent trade. Conversely, periods of limited conquest or military setbacks often reduced the influx of captives, creating scarcity that increased the value of existing slaves. In times when Rome experienced fewer successful campaigns, faced rebellions, or contended with protracted wars that constrained logistics and labor acquisition, the supply of new slaves diminished. Buyers seeking to replace lost laborers or expand their holdings faced higher prices, as sellers recognized the relative scarcity and adjusted valuation accordingly. Scarcity-driven inflation reflected the essential economic principle that availability directly influenced perceived worth, but it also highlighted the broader strategic role of slavery within Roman society, where military success and territorial expansion were inextricably linked to domestic and economic stability. Wars also affected price through indirect economic mechanisms. Large-scale military campaigns placed strains on local economies, disrupted agricultural production, and altered trade patterns, influencing the financial capacity of potential buyers. Estates and households under economic stress might reduce purchasing, temporarily suppressing demand, while periods of wealth accumulation following conquest could increase both the ability and desire to acquire labor at higher cost. Political stability, peace treaties, and the outcomes of rebellion or insurrection similarly contributed to a fluctuating economic environment, in which the market for slaves remained sensitive to macro-level developments. The characteristics of captured slaves themselves were shaped by the circumstances of war, further influencing valuation. Prisoners taken from certain regions were perceived to possess desirable physical, cultural, or intellectual traits, which affected price even in times of abundance. Young, healthy captives from provinces known for military skill, physical resilience, or artistic sophistication often retained higher value despite overall supply increases. Similarly, elite captives, such as those with prior education, social status, or specialized training, could command prices that far exceeded those of typical laborers, illustrating the persistent interplay between individual attributes and macroeconomic forces. The context of capture, whether through large-scale military conquest, small raids, or piracy, also contributed to perceptions of value and scarcity, shaping both immediate price and long-term utility. The cyclical nature of war and conquest introduced temporal rhythms to slave pricing. Periods following major campaigns often saw a rapid influx of captives, with prices adjusting downward in the short term, followed by gradual stabilization as markets absorbed new arrivals and buyers allocated labor across households and estates. Conversely, intervals without substantial military activity created conditions of scarcity, with upward pressure on prices as households competed for limited labor. These cycles, repeated across the decades of Roman expansion, reflected the integration of political and military dynamics into the practical mechanics of the economy. Slavery, far from being isolated from larger historical forces, was intimately connected to the empire's trajectory of conquest, administration, and social control. Wars also influenced long-distance trade in slaves, linking regional markets and creating opportunities for arbitrage. Captives from one province could be transported to urban centers or distant estates, and the relative scarcity or abundance in particular locations determined prices in these secondary markets. Traders and brokers, aware of these regional disparities, could profit from moving slaves from areas of surplus to areas of high demand, demonstrating the sophistication of Roman economic networks. Military campaigns, therefore, shaped both the supply at the point of capture and the broader distribution across the empire, ensuring that political and military events had cascading effects on valuation and market dynamics. In conclusion, the impact of war on slave pricing was multifaceted. Conquest and prisoner influxes created fluctuations in supply, influencing prices according to abundance or scarcity. The characteristics of captives, regional disparities, and logistical considerations further nuanced these effects, while indirect economic consequences of military activity shaped demand and purchasing power. Prices were thus a reflection of a complex interaction between individual attributes, market conditions, and macro-level political realities. Roman slavery, situated at the intersection of human labor, economic calculation, and imperial expansion, demonstrates how the fortunes of the empire itself directly affected the valuation of those held in bondage. As the effects of war on supply and pricing shaped the market, it naturally leads to the next exploration of how the accumulation of wealth and social prestige influenced the pricing and demand for slaves, as ownership was both an economic investment and a status symbol, intertwining human valuation with social hierarchy and cultural expectation. Alongside the influence of war, conquest, and the pursuit of wealth, the Roman slave market was also profoundly shaped by domestic economic pressures and the complexities of personal finance. Debt, bankruptcy, and the inability to meet obligations frequently drove individuals and families to sell themselves or their relatives into bondage, creating a forced market in which human property was not merely a commodity but a necessity of survival. These circumstances added a dimension of volatility to pricing, as economic desperation altered both supply and perceived value, while reinforcing the structural dependence of Roman society on slavery as an institution intertwined with financial stability. Debt in the Roman world was pervasive, and could arise from a variety of sources: failed business ventures, mismanaged estates, medical expenses, or the financial demands of social obligations, such as public games, feasts, or civic contributions. Roman law allowed creditors to claim repayment through the seizure of property, including slaves, and in some cases, the debtor themselves could be offered as security. Such arrangements, often formalized through contractual agreements or legal proceedings, created circumstances in which individuals were compelled into slavery as a means of satisfying outstanding debts. These self-sale transactions, while legally recognized and socially regulated, imposed profound consequences on families, communities, and local economies, producing a segment of the slave market influenced by necessity rather than voluntary exchange. Bankruptcy similarly produced human property for sale. Families unable to maintain estates, meet financial obligations, or sustain households faced the liquidation of assets, which included both movable property and enslaved individuals. In these situations, the market was flooded with captives whose sale reflected immediate need, rather than long-term valuation based on skill, age, or social desirability. Prices in such forced sales were often lower than those in voluntary markets, as the urgency of the seller reduced bargaining power and heightened competition among buyers. However, the presence of such forced sales also created opportunities for more affluent households to acquire slaves at a relative discount, introducing both risk and reward into the economic calculation of purchase. The forced sale of relatives adds yet another layer of complexity. In certain circumstances, Roman families could sell children, spouses, or other members into slavery to settle debts or avoid punitive measures. Such sales were legally sanctioned under Roman law, though they were socially fraught and emotionally complex. The value assigned in these circumstances often diverged from standard market evaluation, influenced instead by immediate economic exigency, the perceived ability of the individual to satisfy creditor demands, and the negotiation skills of intermediaries or agents involved in the sale. These transactions highlight the intersection of private distress and public commerce, illustrating how economic vulnerability translated directly into the human marketplace. This forced market created fluctuations in pricing that extended beyond immediate circumstances. When families were compelled to sell, the rapid introduction of slaves into the marketplace could temporarily depress prices, particularly for individuals lacking specialized skills, youth, or desirable physical attributes. Buyers, aware of the urgency faced by sellers, could negotiate aggressively, leveraging the imbalance of power to obtain labor at reduced cost. Yet even in these situations, certain traits, strength, literacy, craft skill, or aesthetic appeal, maintained their influence on value. demonstrating the resilience of market principles even amidst forced transactions. To human and social dimensions of debt-related sales added a unique texture to the economy of slavery, blending necessity, calculation, and perception. The presence of forced sales also had broader implications for social hierarchy and the perception of wealth. The ability to avoid such financial distress and maintain ownership of laborers signaled economic stability, social competence, and access to resources, reinforcing the connection between slavery and prestige. Conversely, indebted households that sold members into bondage were both practically and symbolically diminished, their loss of property reflecting both economic vulnerability and diminished social standing. The dynamics of debt, bankruptcy, and forced sale thus created a feedback loop in which economic hardship generated labor supply, influenced market prices, and reinforced societal stratification. Legal structures surrounding debt and slavery further shaped the market. Roman law allowed creditors to claim debtors through nexum, a contractual practice whereby an individual pledged personal service as collateral. This legal framework ensured that economic obligations could be enforced through bondage, producing a class of slaves whose entry into the market was dictated by legality and financial necessity rather than traditional capture or purchase. These conditions added predictability to some aspects of supply, while simultaneously introducing volatility, as shifts in local economic conditions, crop yields, or political stability could trigger waves of debt-induced sales. The law, in this way, institutionalized the connection between economic distress and the flow of human property into Roman markets. Cultural attitudes towards debt-induced slavery also influenced pricing. Buyers were cognizant that individuals sold due to financial pressure were likely to comply with authority, having experienced the legal and social mechanisms of compulsion. This perception could enhance value, particularly for labor requiring obedience, reliability, or integration into household management. Yet, moral considerations, while subdued in a pragmatic market context, sometimes moderated prices, reflecting the tension between economic efficiency and the social awareness of human suffering. The forced sale of relatives and debtors thus occupied a morally and economically complex space within the Roman economy. Finally, debt and bankruptcy contributed to the broader rhythm of market fluctuations. Seasonal economic pressures, localized crises, or macroeconomic instability could increase the frequency of forced sales, affecting supply and demand in urban and rural centers alike. The arrival of debt-induced slaves into the marketplace intersected with other market determinants: age, gender, skill, regional origin, and war-related influx, creating a dynamic and layered pricing environment. Understanding this forced market provides essential context for appreciating the fluidity of valuation in Roman society, revealing how private hardship, legal frameworks, and economic necessity collectively influence the calculation of human worth. As the forced sale of individuals and families impacted supply and price, it naturally leads to an examination of long-term investment and economic calculation in slave ownership. For Roman buyers and households considered not only immediate utility, but also potential for training, reproduction, and intergenerational labor contribution, further refining market valuation and social strategy. Beyond the immediate effects of debt, bankruptcy, and forced sales, the valuation of slaves in Roman society was also deeply influenced by the broader rhythms of the economy. Economic cycles, encompassing factors such as harvest yields, famine, trade fluctuations, and political stability, played a subtle yet powerful role in shaping both the cost of human labor and the perception of its utility. Unlike sudden shocks, these trends operated over months or years, producing patterns of scarcity and abundance that buyers, sellers, and estate managers had to anticipate, navigate, and sometimes exploit, revealing the intricate relationship between macroeconomic forces and individual human valuation. Famine, for instance, exerted a direct and immediate impact on the price of slaves. In years of crop failure, whether due to drought, excessive rain, pests, or disease, agricultural estates and households faced constrained resources, reducing their capacity to acquire or maintain laborers. At the same time, mortality among existing populations, both free and enslaved, could temporarily alter labor supply. Estates suffering from famine might be compelled to reduce household size or sell less essential slaves, introducing sudden shifts in market availability. Buyers attuned to these patterns could anticipate periods of reduced demand and adjust offers accordingly, reflecting a sophisticated awareness of economic cycles. Conversely, scarcity of food and stability could increase prices for slaves capable of sustaining production, particularly those with experience in managing agricultural tasks efficiently, emphasizing the nuanced interaction between survival, productivity, and economic calculation. Harvest yields and agricultural productivity also played a crucial role in shaping slave value. In years of abundant harvest, estates generated surplus produce that could be sold or stored, increasing household wealth, and by extension, the capacity to acquire additional labor. A prosperous harvest not only provided immediate resources for purchase, but also reinforced expectations of future stability and income, justifying investment in more skilled or specialized slaves. Conversely, years of poor yield introduced uncertainty, leading buyers to favor lower-cost, versatile laborers over specialized or expensive individuals, and often suppressing prices. These patterns illustrate how seasonal cycles and agricultural output, core to Roman society, translated directly into the ebb and flow of slave markets. Political stability, or the lack thereof, interacted with economic cycles to further influence valuation. In periods of stable governance, effective administration, and consistent law enforcement, trade and commerce flourished, creating predictable market conditions conducive to investment in slaves. Buyers could assess risk with confidence, estimating returns on labor, household management, or artisanal production. Conversely, during political upheaval, civil unrest, or contested succession, economic uncertainty reduced both the demand for slaves and the willingness of sellers to wait for ideal prices. Markets reflected this uncertainty, often exhibiting volatility in pricing, with fluctuations sometimes magnified by regional variations in security, governance, and infrastructure. Long-term economic trends, such as inflation, taxation, or shifts in trade routes, also affected slave value. The Roman economy, particularly during periods of expansion or contraction, experienced variations in currency value, taxation obligations, and commercial opportunity, all of which could alter purchasing power and perceived return on investment. Buyers accounted for these factors when determining price, incorporating not only the immediate utility of a slave, but also the long-term economic context, including potential earnings, contribution to household wealth, and resilience to market shocks. In this way, the calculation of value was inherently forward-looking, reflecting the intersection of microeconomic assessment and macroeconomic awareness. The interconnectedness of these economic cycles meant that the price of a slave at any given moment was rarely determined by a single factor. Instead, it emerged from a complex interplay of supply and demand, regional abundance, seasonal productivity, and overarching political and financial conditions. Markets were sensitive to both localized events, such as the failure of a particular harvest, and empire-wide conditions, such as the expansion of trade networks or military campaigns that introduced new captives. Buyers and sellers, aware of these dynamics, navigated a system in which timing, foresight, and strategic calculation were as crucial as physical assessment of the individual slave. Furthermore, the social implications of economic cycles reinforced their impact on valuation. Prosperous periods allowed households to display wealth through the acquisition of skilled, aesthetically desirable, or exotic slaves, enhancing status and signaling economic competence. Conversely, periods of scarcity constrained choices, emphasizing utility and survival over prestige, and often reducing the premium placed on specialized attributes. In this sense, slave pricing not only reflected practical economic calculation, but also mirrored broader social hierarchies and cultural expectations, intertwining human valuation with status, perception, and aspiration. Transportation and regional distribution added further complexity. Economic cycles did not operate uniformly across the empire. Local conditions could diverge significantly from central trends. A bountiful harvest in one province might coincide with famine in another, creating regional price differentials that traders and buyers could exploit. Similarly, political stability might be maintained in urban centers while rural territories faced disruption, producing localized fluctuations in supply and demand. These variations underscore the sensitivity of the slave market to both macro and micro-level factors, highlighting the sophistication of Roman economic understanding and the adaptability of participants in a dynamic system. Finally, the cyclical nature of economics in Rome highlights the enduring interdependence of human labor, market forces, and societal structure. Slaves were both agents and instruments within these cycles. Their labor produced wealth, maintained households, and sustained agricultural productivity, while their market value reflected the shifting balance of supply, demand, and economic expectation. Understanding these cycles illuminates the broader context in which individual attributes, age, skill, gender, origin, and health, interacted with the rhythms of empire, shaping not only the cost of labor, but also the lived experience of those caught within its calculations. As these economic cycles dictated the ebb and flow of supply and pricing, it naturally leads to the next point of examination: the investment and reproductive potential of slaves, for owners often considered not only immediate utility, but also long-term prospects, including the potential to produce offspring who could themselves become laborers, thereby influencing calculation of value, household strategy, and intergenerational wealth. As economic cycles and agricultural productivity influenced the broader landscape of supply and demand, the practical consideration of monetary value emerged as a central determinant of slave pricing in Rome. The Roman economy operated through a sophisticated system of currency, encompassing denarii, sestertii, and aurei, which facilitated trade, quantified labor, and standardized transactions across the vast empire. Understanding the intersection of these currencies with the valuation of human life provides a tangible measure of how the abstract considerations of skill, age, gender, and origin were translated into economic terms, rendering the invisible architecture of the marketplace visible through numerical representation. The denarius, a silver coin first minted in the late 3rd century BCE, became the standard medium for everyday transactions, including the purchase of slaves. Prices for human property, however, could range widely depending on multiple factors: physical capacity, intellectual ability, origin, and specific skills. For an unskilled agricultural laborer, the cost might be in the lower hundreds of denarii, reflecting both the ubiquity of such individuals and the relatively modest utility in urban households or large estates. In contrast, a literate domestic servant, skilled artisan, or exotic entertainer could command sums several times higher, often reaching into the thousands of denarii. Historical texts and inscriptions illustrate these ranges, revealing not only the variability of prices, but also the structured methodology by which Roman buyers assessed value relative to currency. Sestertii, a larger denomination used primarily for accounting and official transactions, often appear in records as the unit in which bulk or high-value purchases were documented. A household purchasing multiple slaves for an estate might negotiate prices in sestertii, reflecting both scale and formality. For instance, a Roman landowner acquiring laborers for vineyard cultivation could pay tens of thousands of sestertii in a single transaction, while purchasing a single skilled tutor, scribe, or physician slave might require a concentrated investment in sestertii equivalent to several years' wages for a free laborer. These figures illustrate the dual nature of slavery as both functional labor and financial investment, where currency quantified potential productivity, maintenance cost, and the expected return on human capital. Aurei, gold coins of higher denomination, were reserved for transactions involving highly valuable or specialized slaves, often those with rare skills, exotic origin, or elite training. The purchase of a gladiator, professional entertainer, or artisan capable of contributing significantly to the prestige of a household could command multiple aurei, reflecting both rarity and potential utility. References in Roman literature, epitaphs, and legal records suggest that such transactions were carefully calculated, with buyers weighing not only the immediate purchase price, but also expected longevity, productivity, and social return. The use of gold currency for these purchases underscores the perceived exceptional value of certain slaves, signaling both economic and social significance within the imperial context. Historical examples offer concrete insight into the conversion of human attributes into currency. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, references skilled slaves, such as educated Greek tutors, commanding thousands of denarii, while gladiators of notable strength or training could fetch similarly high sums in array. Records from Pompeii indicate that agricultural laborers might be sold for approximately 500 to 2,000 denarii, while domestic slaves with literacy or managerial skill could cost 5 to 10 times that amount. Such records, when aggregated across the empire, reveal a pattern in which currency directly mediated the abstract qualities of the enslaved, age, health, skill, and appearance, into a marketable and comparable measure, bridging the intangible with the economic tangible. The relationship between currency and supply was also influenced by regional variations and logistical factors. In urban centers like Rome or Alexandria, where demand for skilled domestic labor was high, prices in denarii, sestertii, or array were elevated relative to rural estates, reflecting both scarcity and purchasing power. Conversely, provinces with abundant labor supply, particularly following military conquest, could offer lower prices in the same denominations, illustrating the elasticity of currency in response to market conditions. Transportation costs, market fees, and intermediary charges were often incorporated into the total monetary outlay, further complicating the relationship between nominal price and actual value received by the seller, or paid by the buyer. Moreover, the choice of currency had symbolic and practical implications. Denarii and sestertii, familiar and widely circulated, facilitated frequent transactions and bulk purchases, creating fluidity in the marketplace. Aurae, by contrast, signaled exceptional investment and status, often reserved for transactions of strategic or social significance. Buyers and sellers alike understood these subtleties, negotiating not only in terms of numerical value, but also through the semiotics of currency, where the denomination itself communicated social and economic intent. The Roman market was thus both quantitatively and qualitatively mediated, with currency serving as the central language of valuation. The use of money in slave transactions also reflected broader economic trends. Inflation, debasement of coinage, and fluctuations in currency supply could alter real value, affecting both the ability to purchase slaves and the expected return on investment. Buyers and sellers were acutely aware of these factors, often adjusting expectations to accommodate changes in purchasing power, economic stability, and future market conditions. In this way, the interplay between currency, valuation, and economic calculation was both immediate and anticipatory, linking the practical realities of trade with strategic foresight in the management of labor resources. Ultimately, the mediation of slave value through denarii, sestertii, and aurae exemplifies the confluence of human attributes, economic calculation, and social perception. Price, while numeric, encapsulated a complex assessment of skill, potential, and status, translating the intangible qualities of life and labor into a language understood across the empire. Monetary valuation served not only as a practical tool for exchange but also as a lens through which Roman society quantified, measured, and controlled human property, situating slaves at the intersection of commerce, culture, and calculation. As these monetary valuations shape transactions, it naturally leads to the next exploration of regional trade networks, transport, and the distribution of slaves, for the movement of currency and captives across the empire directly influenced price, access, and the economic equilibrium of Roman slavery. As currency and pricing conventions structured the acquisition of human labor, the social and economic stratification of Roman society became increasingly evident in patterns of purchasing behavior. While the market for slaves served practical needs across all levels of society, a distinct contrast existed between ordinary citizens, who often acquired slaves out of necessity, and the elite, whose acquisitions reflected both practical utility and a desire to demonstrate wealth, prestige, and social distinction. This distinction shaped not only the types of slaves purchased, but also the willingness to pay premium prices for attributes beyond mere labor, illustrating the intersection of economic calculation, social signaling, and cultural expectation. For ordinary citizens, the purchase of slaves was typically guided by necessity. Laborers were needed to support households, assist with small-scale agricultural work, or perform tasks that could not otherwise be managed by family members alone. Such acquisitions were measured against the immediate economic capacity of the buyer, the practical utility of the slave, and the prevailing market prices. Typically, these purchases emphasized functional attributes, physical strength, reliability, and adaptability. Buyers were attentive to cost, seeking to obtain the maximum productive potential without exceeding limited means. In this context, pricing was pragmatic, and negotiation was often driven by necessity rather than display. The market for these transactions was competitive yet restrained, reflecting a balance between need and affordability, with the economic reality of the household dictating the limits of expenditure. By contrast, the wealthy elite approached the acquisition of slaves with considerations that extended far beyond immediate utility. In addition to labor, elite households sought slaves as instruments of prestige, symbols of status, and markers of sophistication. This desire influenced both the selection criteria and the willingness to pay, elevating prices for individuals who could confer social advantage, aesthetic appeal, or specialized skill. A young, attractive domestic slave, a skilled Greek tutor, or an accomplished artisan might be purchased at a sum far exceeding the equivalent functional labor, not solely for practical service, but for the reflection of the owner's wealth, taste, and connection to cultural sophistication. The elite's willingness to pay high prices in aure, denarii, or sestati reflects a market in which human property functions simultaneously as labor and as social capital. The differentiation between necessity and luxury extended to household composition and organization. In elite domiciles, a diversity of slaves performed a wide range of functions, from domestic management and entertainment, intellectual tutelage and cultural display. Luxury households invested in training, grooming, and housing for these individuals, further augmenting their value and reinforcing the association between acquisition price and social standing. In contrast, non-elite households typically maintained a smaller complement of laborers, emphasizing utility over aesthetic or social consideration. The contrast demonstrates that, in Roman society, the economic and social dimensions of slavery were intertwined, with pricing reflecting both the immediate functional contribution of the slave and the broader symbolic investment in status. The procurement strategies of wealthy households also influenced market behavior more broadly. Large-scale buyers, such as aristocrats, frequently engaged with specialized brokers or intermediaries to acquire highly skilled or rare slaves, sometimes paying significant premiums to secure individuals who were difficult to obtain. Their willingness to invest heavily in select individuals had ripple effects in regional and urban markets, elevating the perceived value of certain types of labor and setting benchmarks that informed subsequent transactions. The presence of these elite-driven pricing structures created stratified market conditions, where the same attributes, skill, beauty, literacy, or artistic talent, could command drastically different sums depending on the buyer's resources, social expectations, and intended purpose. Luxury considerations also shaped the geographical sourcing of slaves. The elite often sought individuals from distant provinces or culturally esteemed regions, perceiving these slaves as not only functionally capable, but also exotic or refined. Such provenance was a factor in determining price, as buyers were willing to pay for the combination of skill, appearance, and social cachet that accompanied these individuals. Ordinary citizens, operating within local markets, had more limited access to distant or highly specialized labor, and their purchases remained grounded in local supply, affordability, and immediate household need. This distinction further underscores the interplay between economic capacity, social aspiration, and market valuation in Roman society. The social visibility of slave acquisition also contributed to the differentiation between luxury and necessity. In elite households, the display of skilled, attractive, or rare slaves was an extension of public image and cultural sophistication. These transactions, often recorded in literature, inscriptions, or correspondence, served as indicators of taste, refinement, and the ability to participate in elite social networks. In contrast, the acquisition of labor for necessity was more private, functional, and utilitarian, rarely attracting public attention. This visibility reinforced pricing structures and the social calculus of value, demonstrating that for the wealthy, the cost of a slave encompassed not only immediate labor, but also ongoing social signaling and perceived contribution to household prestige. Moreover, the contrast between luxury and necessity extended into the management and maintenance of slaves. Elite households invested in diet, health, education, and even leisure for select individuals, further reinforcing their value and the justification for higher purchase prices. Ordinary households, constrained by limited resources, prioritized physical labor and basic sustenance, ensuring that costs remained aligned with necessity. The divergence in investment and expenditure highlights how economic, social, and cultural considerations coalesced in the calculation of value, illustrating a continuum in which slavery was simultaneously a practical necessity and a medium for demonstrating wealth and refinement. In essence, the distinction between ordinary citizens and the elite illuminates the dual role of slavery in Roman society, as essential labor supporting survival and productivity, and as a marker of prestige and luxury reflecting broader social hierarchies. Pricing in this context was not merely an economic transaction but a complex integration of functionality, scarcity, skill, aesthetic appeal, and social signaling, translating human attributes and societal expectations into monetary terms. The flow of wealth, ambition, and cultural aspiration through the marketplace demonstrates how the acquisition of slaves was inseparable from the stratified structure of Roman life. As the interplay between luxury, necessity, and social status shaped purchasing patterns, it naturally leads to an exploration of how the scale and specialization of agricultural and urban estates influenced the overall demand and cost of slaves, for these structural factors determined the baseline market needs that ultimately intersected with social aspiration and economic capacity. Alongside distinctions between luxury and necessity in household acquisitions, the Roman slave market was also profoundly shaped by the methods through which sellers publicized their wares. In a society that relied on both oral communication and written documentation, the presentation of slaves, through public announcements, inscriptions, and word of mouth, affected not only the visibility of individual captives, but also perceptions of value, competitive dynamics, and ultimately the prices commanded. These practices illustrate the subtle yet pervasive influence of information flow on market behavior, revealing the sophistication of Roman commerce and the psychological dimensions embedded in human trade. Public announcements, often made in bustling forums, marketplaces, or at city gates, served as a primary mechanism for introducing potential buyers to available slaves. Sellers employed persuasive techniques, highlighting physical attributes, skills, training, and provenance, thereby framing the perceived value of the individuals for sale. These announcements were carefully calibrated, emphasizing desirable qualities could elevate price, while the presence of limitations such as age or health concerns might be downplayed or strategically contextualized. The performance of value through verbal description reflects the early recognition of marketing as a tool, shaping not only the demand for labor, but also the expectations and willingness of buyers to invest in particular slaves. Written notices, in the form of inscribed advertisements, public notices, or listings on wax tablets, complemented oral announcements and provided a lasting reference for potential buyers. In urban centers such as Rome, Pompeii, and Ostia, inscriptions recording the sale of slaves were often displayed in prominent locations, sometimes including details about age, skill, literacy, and special talents. These written communications served multiple purposes. They enhanced transparency, widened the pool of prospective purchasers, and created an aura of legitimacy around the transaction. The careful crafting of such notices allowed sellers to highlight attributes that justified higher prices, while also signaling to competitors and buyers the seriousness and credibility of the sale. Word of mouth functioned as an equally potent vehicle for market information, particularly in smaller towns or rural estates. Trusted intermediaries, brokers, or neighbors communicated the availability, characteristics, and asking price of slaves, ensuring that knowledge of potential purchases circulated through socially mediated networks. The reputations of sellers and the credibility of the information conveyed played a critical role in shaping market expectations. Buyers relied on the assessment of others to gauge fairness, quality, and the relative value of individuals, demonstrating the interplay between social capital and economic calculation. This form of advertisement, while less formal than inscriptions, had the advantage of immediacy and personal endorsement, which could influence price negotiation and transaction outcomes. The strategic dissemination of information also allowed sellers to manipulate perceptions of scarcity and desirability. By emphasizing unique skills, rare provenance, or exceptional youth, sellers could elevate demand, creating a perception of exclusivity that justified premium pricing. Conversely, highlighting utility, adaptability, or readiness for labor could appeal to practical buyers, particularly those constrained by budget or seeking immediate functional return. This dual approach reflects an early form of market segmentation, where the same product, a human laborer, was presented differently depending on audience, context, and desired outcome, shaping both perception and price. Auction houses and marketplaces, often sites of vivid activity and sensory complexity, combined these methods in dynamic ways. Public announcements, written notices, and verbal negotiation intermingled, creating a layered informational environment in which buyers could compare, evaluate, and assess options. The presence of multiple buyers in close proximity introduced competitive pressure, which in turn influenced the final sale price. Auctions facilitated both transparency and tension, amplifying the effect of advertising, reputation, and perceived scarcity on pricing outcomes. The integration of oral, written, and performative information channels highlights the sophistication of Roman marketing practices and their direct impact on economic valuation. Furthermore, the way sellers framed information affected buyer psychology, emphasizing desirable traits, downplaying limitations, or situating the individual within a narrative of provenance, skill, or training, could enhance perceived value. Much as modern marketing techniques rely on presentation and storytelling, buyers in turn interpreted these cues through their understanding of the broader social and economic context, assessing whether the investment aligned with household needs, labor potential, and anticipated social advantage. The interplay between presentation and perception illustrates how information flow itself functioned as a form of economic leverage within the market for human labor. These practices were not uniform across regions or social strata. Urban markets, with high competition and larger numbers of buyers, often relied more heavily on written notices and public announcements, creating a relatively formalized system of communication and price signaling. In rural or provincial settings where personal networks dominated, word of mouth and trusted intermediaries played a more prominent role, emphasizing relational trust and social knowledge. In all cases, however, the dissemination of information affected supply and demand, guided negotiation, and mediated perceptions of value, demonstrating the subtle interconnection between communication practices and economic outcomes. Ultimately, the use of announcements, inscriptions, and verbal networks underscores the sophistication and adaptability of the Roman slave market. Pricing was not determined solely by physical or skill-based attributes. It was also influenced by perception, credibility, and strategic presentation. Sellers who effectively leveraged multiple channels of communication could elevate value, attract a wider pool of buyers, and navigate the complex interplay of scarcity, demand, and social expectation. These practices reveal a marketplace attuned not only to economic calculation, but also to human psychology, social hierarchy, and the power of information, making the dissemination of knowledge a central factor in the valuation of slaves. As the dissemination of information shaped market perception and pricing, it naturally leads to the next point: how the health, physical condition, and overall well-being of slaves influenced their valuation. For even the most skillfully advertised or socially prestigious individual had a market value closely tied to their corporeal capacity and long-term utility. The economic calculus of slavery extended far beyond the mere acquisition of individuals. It encompassed a detailed assessment of the potential return on investment, particularly in the realm of agriculture, which formed the backbone of the Roman economy. Agricultural laborers were not simply instruments of toil but carefully evaluated contributors to land productivity, with their market value reflecting anticipated yields, efficiency and overall capacity to sustain and enhance estate wealth. Understanding this relationship illuminates the interdependence between human labor, land management and economic strategy that underpinned the valuation of slaves across the empire. Agriculture in Roman society was diverse, encompassing small family plots, medium-scale farms and vast estates latifundia that produced wheat, olives, grapes and a variety of other crops. The scale and specialization of the estate determined both the number of slaves required and the nature of labor sought. A large vineyard in central Italy, for example, demanded not only physical endurance for planting, pruning and harvesting, but also knowledge of irrigation, soil management and seasonal timing. Buyers therefore assessed potential laborers not merely by strength but also by experience and adaptability. The more a slave could contribute to productivity with minimal supervision or training, the higher the expected return on investment and consequently, the higher the price a prudent purchaser was willing to pay. Return on investment in agricultural slaves was influenced by several factors. Age and physical condition remained primary considerations. Younger, stronger laborers capable of sustained work were valued more highly, as they promised multiple years of productive service. Health was closely scrutinized, for even minor weaknesses or chronic conditions could reduce efficiency and increase the cost of upkeep. Moreover, skills specific to agricultural tasks such as knowledge of viticulture, animal husbandry, or crop rotation added a premium to valuation, particularly for estates seeking to maximize yield and minimize waste. Historical records suggest that these specialized laborers could command prices several times higher than unskilled field hands, reflecting both their rarity and the economic advantage they conferred to the estate. The potential for productivity also extended to consideration of reproductive capacity, particularly for female agricultural laborers. Owners recognized that a female slave who could bear children would not only contribute to immediate labor, but also expand the future workforce, reducing the need to purchase additional slaves. This calculation was particularly relevant on larger estates, where multi-generational planning for labor needs intersected with investment strategy. The anticipated offspring were evaluated as extensions of economic potential, linking reproductive capability to long-term returns, and influencing the premium attached to certain individuals within the agricultural labor market. Regional factors further influenced agricultural valuation. Estates in Italy, North Africa, Gaul or Egypt faced differing climatic conditions, soil quality, and crop cycles, which affected both labor requirements and expected yield. Buyers accounted for these variables when assessing the potential economic contribution of a slave, sometimes favoring individuals with experience in similar environments or knowledge transferable to specific crops. Local market conditions, including the availability of free labor, regional demand for agricultural produce, and proximity to transportation routes for trade, further shaped the cost-benefit analysis underlying pricing. The valuation of agricultural slaves thus reflected a synthesis of individual capacity, environmental suitability, and market strategy. Maintenance costs also played a critical role in calculating value. The provisioning of food, shelter, and basic medical care for slaves represented an ongoing investment, and buyers weighed these expenditures against expected returns from labor output. A laborer who required minimal oversight and could sustain high productivity with modest maintenance represented a particularly advantageous acquisition. Conversely, a high-maintenance individual, or one requiring specialized care, might reduce net returns and lower market price, even if they possessed desirable skills or attributes. This interplay between input cost and anticipated output illustrates the sophisticated economic reasoning embedded within slave valuation for agricultural purposes. Agricultural valuation extended beyond direct labor to include associated responsibilities such as supervising other workers, managing tools and equipment, and implementing efficient cultivation techniques. Slaves who could assume supervisory roles, maintain infrastructure, or optimize production were considered highly valuable. as they enhanced the estate's overall efficiency. The differentiation between ordinary laborers and those capable of strategic contribution demonstrates the layered assessment of value in Roman agriculture, where market price reflected not only physical capacity, but also intellectual and managerial aptitude. The relationship between productivity and price was further reinforced by historical records, indicating the correlation between estate output and labor investment. Owners of extensive estates documented yields, production efficiency, and the cost-benefit ratio of their workforce, providing evidence that agricultural slaves were appraised in economic terms analogous to modern labor investment analysis. The anticipation of seasonal variations, crop failure, and regional disruptions factored into these calculations, making the acquisition of labor both a strategic and financial decision, deeply intertwined with the larger economic context of the empire. Finally, the valuation of agricultural laborers demonstrates the interconnection of multiple factors: physical capacity, skill, experience, reproductive potential, maintenance cost, and expected productivity. Each slave represented a complex bundle of potential contributions, quantified through careful observation, comparison, and calculation. The cost assigned to such individuals reflected not only immediate utility, but also anticipated long-term returns, aligning human labor with the broader goals of estate management, wealth accumulation, and social status. This careful balancing of investment and output underlines the systematic and strategic nature of Roman slavery, situating each individual within the economic calculus of agricultural production. As agricultural productivity and investment strategies shaped market dynamics, the next point naturally follows the role of urban trades, crafts, and artisanal skills in shaping the market for specialized labor, where the principles of valuation observed in agriculture intersected with urban demands, guilds, and skill hierarchies, producing another dimension of pricing and human capital management. As agricultural and artisanal considerations defined much of the immediate economic utility of slaves, Roman owners were acutely aware that the cost of acquisition represented only the beginning of a far more complex financial equation. The ongoing maintenance of human property, including provisions for food, clothing, shelter, and medical care, directly influenced the net value and effective cost of a slave, while longevity and anticipated lifespan further framed the calculus of investment, tying the abstract concept of human labor to measurable economic outcomes. In this way, the Roman understanding of slavery was not merely transactional but encompassed a sustained assessment of total expenditure and return over time. Maintenance costs varied according to the type of labor, the status of the household, and the expectations of health and appearance. Agricultural laborers required modest sustenance sufficient to support physical exertion, with diet typically comprising cereals, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish, depending on the wealth and preferences of the estate owner. Clothing and footwear were functional, designed to withstand heavy labor while offering minimal comfort, and shelter was often communal, emphasizing practicality over comfort. Even these basic provisions, however, represented a recurring expense, and prudent owners accounted for these costs in estimating the effective value of a purchased laborer. In urban or elite households, maintenance was more elaborate. Domestic slaves, tutors, physicians, or entertainers might receive individualized attention, higher quality clothing, and better accommodations, reflecting both their functional role and social significance. Appearance and conduct were essential to the household's reputation. A well-fed, well-dressed, and healthy slave symbolized refinement and attention to status. These investments increased upfront and recurring costs, but were deemed necessary to preserve the utility, productivity, and prestige associated with each individual. Consequently, the price of such slaves encompassed not only acquisition, but also projected upkeep, creating a more comprehensive picture of the economic commitment involved. Medical care and attention to health further complicated the maintenance equation. Slaves, like free citizens, were subject to disease, injury, and fatigue, with their productivity directly tied to physical well-being. Owners employed a range of strategies to mitigate these risks: diet regulation, bathing practices, rest periods, and when feasible, access to physicians or herbal remedies. Illness or injury could dramatically reduce a slave's effective contribution, lowering net return on investment, and sometimes prompting the sale of individuals whose health had deteriorated. These considerations underscore the intricate awareness of lifespan risk, where longevity, vitality, and anticipated years of service were integral to the calculation of value. Longevity itself represented a crucial variable in effective cost assessment. A young, healthy slave promised many years of productive labor, enhancing the long-term return relative to initial outlay and ongoing maintenance. Conversely, an older individual, or one exhibiting early signs of chronic illness or physical decline, offered limited temporal utility, thereby lowering market price. Buyers considered both current condition and projected lifespan, often estimating labor contribution over multiple years, integrating seasonal productivity, reproductive potential, and capacity to adapt to evolving household or estate needs. This forward-looking assessment demonstrates the sophistication of Roman economic reasoning and the integration of demographic and physiological factors into commercial calculation. Maintenance costs also included attention to training, supervision, and integration within the household or estate. Newly acquired slaves often required instruction in tasks, adherence to household norms, and coordination with other laborers, creating an initial investment in time and resources before maximum productivity was realized. Skilled artisans or domestic slaves with specialized knowledge required additional oversight or mentoring, ensuring their abilities were fully harnessed for the benefit of the owner. The cumulative effect of these expenditures, when balanced against anticipated contribution, informed both willingness to pay and strategic decisions regarding the number and type of slaves to acquire. Regional and environmental conditions further influenced maintenance and lifespan calculations. Agricultural laborers in hotter climates, for example, faced greater exposure to sun and heat, necessitating adjustments in diet, hydration, and rest, while urban slaves contended with crowding, pollution, and urban disease. The quality of housing, availability of foodstuffs, and general sanitary conditions affected both longevity and productivity, thereby impacting effective cost. Buyers and estate managers who could anticipate or mitigate these factors improved the efficiency of their investment, highlighting the intersection of environmental awareness and economic foresight in Roman slave management. From a broader perspective, these maintenance and lifespan considerations integrated seamlessly with earlier assessments of purchase price, skill, and social function. The total economic picture encompassed initial outlay, expected utility, ongoing provisioning, and anticipated longevity, producing a nuanced understanding of human property as both immediate labor and enduring investment. In practical terms, this approach allowed owners to evaluate risk, optimize resource allocation, and make informed choices regarding both acquisition and retention. The combination of empirical observation, demographic reasoning, and fiscal calculation illustrates a level of sophistication in Roman markets that bridged social, economic, and practical imperatives. Ultimately, the interplay of purchase price, ongoing maintenance, and lifespan demonstrates the systemic nature of Roman slavery as an economic institution. Slaves were not only laborers but financial assets, their market value reflecting a continuous assessment of cost, utility, and potential return. Every decision from acquisition to upkeep, from diet to training, was mediated by careful calculation, balancing immediate needs against long-term investment. The Roman approach to human property was thus deeply analytical, integrating social expectation, practical utility, and financial prudence into a comprehensive system of valuation that governed both the lives of slaves and the fortunes of those who owned them. As these calculations of ongoing cost and anticipated utility shape decisions, it naturally leads to the next point: the market for specialized urban and domestic laborers, where the interplay of skill, appearance, and household expectation introduced further complexity into pricing, investment, and social signaling, expanding the understanding of value beyond purely agricultural considerations. As Roman households navigated the complex calculus of acquisition, maintenance, and productivity, the concept of manumission, the formal freeing of slaves, introduced yet another layer of economic and social consideration. Manumission was not merely a legal or moral act, it carried tangible financial implications for owners, influenced labor planning, and subtly shaped initial pricing in the marketplace. The prospect that a slave might one day transition from property to free person required careful anticipation, reflecting the intricate relationship between law, custom, and economics that permeated Roman society. Manumission could occur through several avenues, including formal declarations before magistrates, inclusion in a master's will, or by purchase of freedom by the slave themselves. In all cases, the process entailed costs, both explicit and implicit, that affected the valuation of slaves at the time of purchase. Masters might anticipate the eventual reduction of their workforce, adjust expectations of long-term utility, or incorporate potential compensation into the initial sale price. Buyers, aware of the legal frameworks governing manumission, often factored this eventuality into their financial calculations, reducing the amount they were willing to pay for a slave who might not remain under permanent control. Conversely, slaves who were highly skilled, essential to household operations, or unlikely to be manumitted soon commanded higher prices, as their expected years of labor promised stable return on investment. The economic implications extended beyond mere price adjustment. Slaves who were likely candidates for manumission, due to age, loyalty, or special services, represented a dual consideration for owners: the value of current labor and the cost associated with eventual freedom. Some masters required formal contracts or agreements for slaves who had the means to purchase their liberty, structuring repayment or redemption plans that allowed the slave to accumulate resources toward manumission. In such cases, the owner might recover some portion of investment through payment, partially offsetting the loss of future labor. The careful balancing of anticipated payment, ongoing utility, and the timing of manumission illustrates the sophisticated financial reasoning inherent in Roman slave management. Social conventions further influenced these economic calculations. Manumitted slaves did not disappear from the household or the broader social network. They often remained in advisory, managerial, or quasi-familial roles, maintaining connections that were valuable to both parties. Masters could anticipate benefits from a freedman's loyalty, skill, or continued service, integrating these potential advantages into pricing strategies at the point of acquisition. The expectation that a loyal, long-serving slave might eventually gain freedom added complexity to market behavior, as buyers weighed immediate cost against eventual shifts in labor structure and household dynamics. Legal frameworks governing manumission were explicit and codified, providing clear rules about how and when slaves could be freed and the rights they would subsequently enjoy. Freedmen, or liberty, acquired partial citizenship, could engage in trade and sometimes inherited property from former masters, depending on the nature of the manumission. These rights, while advantageous for the individual, introduced economic considerations for the former master, including potential shifts in household labor, alteration of economic networks, and long-term social influence. The anticipation of these outcomes was reflected in pricing and selection of slaves, emphasizing not only functional attributes, but also projected social trajectory. Historical records suggest that certain categories of slaves were systematically valued higher or lower depending on perceived likelihood of manumission. Young, healthy, skilled laborers or culturally esteemed domestic attendants were considered long-term investments and thus commanded higher prices, whereas older individuals, or those nearing the end of life, were priced with the expectation of shorter-term utility. The anticipation of freedom for particular individuals, whether through legal provision or self-purchase, shaped negotiation, contract design, and the broader market dynamics, revealing an economy in which human potential was quantified, not only by immediate labor, but also by projected lifespan and social transition. Manumission also intersected with broader economic and cultural incentives. Owners sometimes employed the promise of freedom as motivation, enhancing productivity, loyalty, or adherence to household norms. Such incentives reflected a pragmatic understanding of human behavior, where anticipated liberation could enhance economic output and contribute to the owner's long-term interests. These considerations further complicated the valuation of slaves, integrating psychological and social expectations with monetary assessment and practical utility. making the marketplace a reflection of both economic calculation and nuanced human understanding. The broader societal context amplified the significance of manumission in shaping economic expectations. Freedmen could contribute to local economies, act as intermediaries in commerce, or participate in cultural and religious life, often maintaining enduring ties with their former owners. The anticipation of these outcomes enhanced social networks, business connections, and loyalty was embedded in the initial valuation of slaves, demonstrating that price was informed not only by immediate labor or skill, but also by projected long-term utility, extending beyond the household itself. In this way, the market for slaves integrated both quantitative and qualitative dimensions, balancing labor, cost, and the social potential of each individual. Ultimately, the prospect of manumission exemplifies the layered economic reasoning that characterized Roman slavery. Slaves were appraised not only for their immediate productive capacity, but also for potential transitions in status, lifespan, and household or societal influence. The legal, social, and economic dimensions of freedom informed purchasing decisions, influenced prices, and created a marketplace in which anticipated change was as significant as present reality. Owners, brokers, and buyers alike navigated this complexity, weighing the costs and benefits of investment in human property, integrating long-term projections into the tangible reality of acquisition and maintenance. As the interplay between manumission, lifespan, and household utility shaped market behavior, it naturally leads to the next point: how broader economic conditions, including inflation, scarcity, and political instability, influenced slave prices across the empire. For these macroeconomic forces intersected with legal, social, and practical considerations to determine both the cost and availability of labor. Alongside legal, economic, and practical considerations, the valuation of slaves in Roman society was profoundly shaped by prevailing social perceptions. Slavery was not simply a transactional arrangement. It was deeply embedded within moral, cultural, and philosophical frameworks that influenced how individuals were assessed, how their labor was understood, and ultimately how they were priced. The interaction between economic utility and social judgment created a subtle but pervasive effect on market behavior, reflecting the broader tapestry of Roman society, in which human property existed both as a practical instrument and a moral symbol. Roman attitudes towards slavery were multifaceted, combining acknowledgement of necessity, acceptance of hierarchy, and moral rationalization. Philosophical discourse, literary depictions, and social commentary frequently characterized slaves as essential for the functioning of households, estates, and urban operations. They were recognized for their labor, skill, and contribution to economic productivity, which in turn reinforced their tangible market value. Simultaneously, cultural norms and moral reasoning delineated boundaries between acceptable and idealized types of labor, between servitude and freedom, and between those deemed suitable for domestic care versus physical toil. These conceptual frameworks influenced how potential buyers assessed the desirability of individuals, guiding selection, negotiation, and pricing in ways that extended beyond immediate material utility. Social perception also interacted with status considerations, particularly for elite households. Possession of highly skilled, aesthetically appealing, or culturally refined slaves served as a marker of sophistication, wealth, and social influence. In this context, value was partly symbolic. A slave's price reflected not only labor potential, but also social capital, representing the ability to display discernment, taste, and participation in the upper echelons of society. Buyers in such settings were attuned to societal expectations, aware that the market value of a slave could be augmented by perceived rarity, refinement, or the alignment of attributes with elite cultural ideals. The marketplace therefore functioned not only as an economic arena, but also as a stage upon which social hierarchies and moral conceptions were enacted and reinforced. Conversely, social stigma and moral judgment could suppress value in certain cases. Slaves associated with undesirable tasks, such as menial labor, sanitation, or punishment, were typically assigned lower prices, reflecting both the physical and symbolic nature of their work. Perceptions of temperament, character, and comportment were also factors. Individuals believed to be rebellious, lazy, or otherwise difficult to manage were evaluated not only for risk to productivity, but also for potential social and moral implications within the household. Buyers factored these reputational elements into their financial calculations, demonstrating that social perception operated in tandem with practical assessment to shape market dynamics. Cultural and regional variations further nuanced these perceptions. In urban centers, where visibility, status, and social interaction were pronounced, the market for aesthetically or intellectually refined slaves was more pronounced, and social perception had a stronger impact on pricing. In rural areas where practical utility dominated, social evaluation remained relevant, but was often subordinated to functional capacity, endurance, and reproductive potential. This interplay between environment, societal norms, and economic calculation created a spectrum of valuation, illustrating the complexity of Roman attitudes toward human property. Religious and philosophical thought also influenced perception. Roman authors and moralists occasionally commented on the ethical dimensions of slavery, recognizing the humanity of individuals while simultaneously asserting the social necessity of their subjugation. These reflections shaped broader societal norms, creating an environment in which the assessment of a slave included subtle moral judgments. Buyers consciously or unconsciously absorbed these attitudes, which in turn informed negotiation, selection, and willingness to pay. The interweaving of moral, cultural, and economic valuation illustrates the depth to which social perception mediated market behavior. Public observation played an additional role. The display of slaves in marketplaces, forums, and auctions subjected individuals to scrutiny, evaluation, and comparison. Their appearance, comportment, and comportment in social situations influenced collective perception, affecting both individual desirability and price. A slave's marketability was therefore a composite of tangible skills, physical condition, and the broader societal gaze, merging economic assessment with social judgment in a dynamic process that continuously shaped valuation. Ultimately, the economic pricing of slaves in Roman society cannot be disentangled from social perception. Value was not merely the product of labor potential or skill, it was intertwined with cultural expectations, moral reasoning, status signaling, and collective judgment. Buyers assessed not only what the individual could do, but also how the individual fit within prevailing societal norms, household expectations, and moral frameworks. This integration of social, ethical, and economic factors produced a nuanced market in which price reflected the totality of anticipated utility, symbolic value, and societal approval. As social perception influenced market dynamics, it naturally leads to the final point. Closing reflections on the cumulative factors shaping slave valuation, integrating economic, legal, social, and moral dimensions to understand the full picture of how human labor was quantified and commodified within the Roman world. As Roman society evolved and the empire expanded, the structures, norms, and economics of slavery did not remain static. By the late empire, the market for human labor experienced profound shifts driven by demographic pressures, economic strain, and the gradual emergence of alternative systems of labor. Scarcity of new captives, inflationary pressures, and the increasing reliance on tenant farming or other semi-free labor arrangements introduced new dynamics that transformed both the availability and perceived value of slaves. These changes illustrate that the valuation of human property was intimately connected to broader societal trends, and that markets were always contingent upon the fluctuating conditions of empire, economy, and culture. Scarcity became a defining feature of the late Roman slave market. Conquests that had once flooded the markets with captives slowed as the empire stabilized its borders and military expansion waned. Wars and raids no longer produced the same steady supply of individuals, creating a tighter market in which buyers faced limited options and sellers could command higher prices for high-demand categories. At the same time, demographic pressures, including declining birth rates, disease, and regional disruptions, further constrained the pool of potential slaves, intensifying competition among purchasers and amplifying the impact of perceived scarcity on market behavior. The supply-driven scarcity highlights the close interplay between military, demographic, and economic factors in determining the practical value of slaves. Inflation, driven by debasement of currency, rising prices for essential goods, and broader economic instability, further affected slave valuation. Whereas early imperial denarii and sestertii had provided relatively stable benchmarks for purchase, late imperial economic volatility introduced uncertainty. Buyers needed to consider not only the nominal price of a slave, but also the broader purchasing power and the anticipated cost of maintenance. This consideration created a more cautious approach to acquisition, as the effective value of both money and human labor became increasingly difficult to predict. Sellers aware of these pressures sometimes adjusted pricing strategies to balance immediate profit against longer-term risk, illustrating the fluidity of market dynamics under economic strain. Alongside these material factors, the structure of labor itself began to transform. As large estates encountered shortages of traditional slave labor or sought more reliable and sustainable arrangements, alternative labor systems emerged, including colony, tenant farmers who were bound to the land but retained some personal autonomy. These semi-free laborers offered certain advantages to estate owners: predictable service, lower upfront costs, and reduced maintenance obligations. The increasing reliance on such arrangements gradually shifted the perceived value of traditional slaves, as they were no longer the sole or indispensable source of labor for agricultural and domestic work. Market expectations adjusted accordingly, reflecting the intersection of labor availability, legal status, and economic practicality. The transformation of the market also had social and moral dimensions. As slavery became less ubiquitous and other forms of labor more common, perceptions of status, desirability, and moral justification evolved. Slaves who remained available for purchase carried both practical and symbolic significance. Their rarity could enhance value, yet their purchase increasingly represented a strategic choice rather than an unquestioned necessity. Buyers and sellers alike navigated this evolving landscape, balancing historical norms against emerging realities, and adjusting expectations regarding productivity, cost, and social implications. The integration of these factors demonstrates the complex interdependence of economics, morality, and societal adaptation in shaping late imperial markets. Moreover, the transition toward alternative labor systems introduced considerations of flexibility, reliability, and long-term planning. Colony and other semi-free laborers, while not slaves in the traditional sense, required contracts, agreements, and ongoing negotiation, reflecting a shift from the absolute control afforded by chattel slavery to a more managed and conditional form of labor arrangement. These systemic changes affected the relative valuation of remaining slaves, with highly skilled, versatile, or socially integrated individuals commanding premiums as strategic assets within a transforming economic and social environment. The nuanced adaptation of market practices illustrates the responsiveness of Roman economic actors to broader shifts in labor structure and societal organization. Regional variations were evident in these trends. Urban centers, where domestic and artisanal labor remained essential, continued to maintain active slave markets, though scarcity and inflationary pressures influenced pricing and selection. Rural estates, facing both demographic contraction and the rise of tenant-based labor, increasingly relied on mixed labor strategies, blending existing slaves with semi-free workers to maintain productivity. The resulting hybrid systems created dynamic, context-specific valuations, with each transaction reflecting a combination of immediate utility, long-term expectation, and adaptation to shifting economic, demographic, and social realities. Finally, the decline and transformation of the slave market underscore the broader lesson that valuation was never static. Market forces, supply, demand, economic fluctuation, and alternative labor structures interacted continuously with legal, social, and cultural frameworks to shape the perceived worth of individuals. Slaves remained central to the functioning of Roman society for centuries, yet their value was in constant dialogue with the changing conditions of empire, economy, and population. Understanding these late imperial trends illuminates the broader arc of Roman economic history, revealing the interplay of scarcity, innovation, and adaptation in the human marketplace. as these late imperial shifts redefined both the practical and symbolic value of slaves. The natural progression leads to the final reflection on the cumulative economic, legal, social, and moral factors that determine their overall market value, tying together the intricate web of considerations that shape the purchase, maintenance, and perception of human labor throughout the Roman world. As the threads of Roman economic, legal, social, and cultural practice are woven together, the cumulative picture of slavery and its market becomes increasingly complex yet undeniably coherent. The valuation of human beings in ancient Rome was a multifaceted enterprise, informed by immediate labor potential, skill, age, gender, regional context, societal perception, maintenance costs, and the possibilities of manumission or alternative labor systems. Across centuries, this intricate system reflected both pragmatic considerations and symbolic significance, shaping not only the daily functioning of households and estates, but also the broader structure of Roman society itself. The study of these valuations offers modern historians insight into the interplay between economy and social hierarchy, revealing how deeply embedded slavery was within the machinery of empire. From the earliest stages of conquest to the transformations of the late empire, slaves were considered both instruments of labor and measurable investments. Roman buyers and owners approached the acquisition of slaves with a combination of economic calculation, practical assessment, and social awareness. Each individual represented a bundle of potential productivity, reproductive capacity, skill, and social utility, with price determined by a delicate balance of these factors. Legal frameworks ensured clarity in ownership and potential for manumission, while social perception shaped desirability and the symbolic value of possession. Maintenance and lifespan calculations reinforced the notion of slaves as long-term assets, integrating ongoing costs into the financial calculus. The marketplace therefore functioned as a space where human labor, social expectations, and economic logic converged, producing a nuanced and adaptive system of valuation. Modern understanding of these processes relies heavily on the careful reconstruction of historical sources. Ancient texts, including legal codices, personal letters, inscriptions, and literary accounts, provide glimpses into both the mechanisms and the ethics of slave markets. Authors such as Cicero, Seneca, and Pliny occasionally referenced prices, attributes, or transactions, while funerary inscriptions and epitaphs sometimes preserve the names and origins of slaves, allowing scholars to infer value based on role, skill, or origin. Archaeological evidence ranging from household layouts, tools, and workshops to records of estates and tombstones offers material context for understanding the labor demands and social positioning of enslaved individuals. Through careful synthesis of textual and archaeological evidence, historians can estimate the relative cost of different categories of slaves, reconstruct market dynamics, and explore the social logic that underpinned valuation. The legacy of Roman slave pricing extends beyond the numbers themselves. By examining the interplay of age, gender, skill, health, maintenance, and societal perception, we gain insight into the priorities, anxieties, and rationales of Roman buyers and households. Prices reflected both tangible contributions and intangible qualities. A skilled artisan, a healthy laborer, or a domestic attendant of refined appearance could command higher sums not merely because of work performed, but because of the broader social and symbolic value attached. Similarly, the risk of rebellion, illness, or early death tempered expectations and informed negotiation, highlighting the careful attention to both immediate and projected utility. The market for slaves, therefore, functioned as a mirror of Roman society, reflecting hierarchies, aspirations, and the pervasive integration of human labor into economic life. Moreover, the study of these markets allows contemporary audiences to understand the human dimensions often obscured by figures and transactions. Slaves were people whose bodies, skills, and labor were assessed in financial terms, yet they existed within households, communities, and social networks, shaping and shaped by the world around them. The economic logic applied to their valuation interacted with social norms, ethical reasoning, and cultural expectations, illustrating that Roman slavery was simultaneously pragmatic and deeply human in its consequences. Modern reconstructions, though necessarily mediated through fragmentary sources, provide a window into these dynamics, offering insight not only into ancient economic practices but also into enduring questions of labor, value, and human dignity. Late imperial transformations, including scarcity, inflation, and alternative labor arrangements, underscore the adaptability and vulnerability of these systems. As markets shifted, as conquests waned, and as tenant-based labor became more common, the price of slaves and the logic of acquisition evolved, reflecting the responsiveness of Roman economic actors to broader societal pressures. These historical developments illuminate the interconnectedness of supply, demand, social perception, and legal frameworks, demonstrating that human labor, even when commodified, was inseparable from the conditions, structures, and transformations of the society that depended upon it. In conclusion, the economic logic of Roman slave pricing provides a window into the practical, social, and moral dimensions of ancient life. By integrating detailed knowledge of markets, law, household management, and social expectation, modern historians are able to reconstruct the values assigned to individuals and understand the mechanisms that sustained one of the most significant institutions of the Roman world, slavery, and the meticulous attention to pricing and valuation it entailed, left a lasting mark on Roman society, shaping economic relationships, household strategies, and social hierarchies. Through the careful study of texts, archaeology, and inscriptions, the legacy of these systems continues to inform our understanding of human labor, economic calculation, and societal organization in one of history's most influential civilizations. Thus, from initial acquisition through labor deployment, maintenance, manumission, and eventual societal transformation, the story of Roman slave pricing reflects both the meticulous reasoning of ancient buyers and the enduring consequences of a system that quantified human life in economic terms. It is a story that, while bound in the past, resonates with modern inquiries into the intersection of labor, value, and morality, and it provides a lens through which to comprehend the intricate interweaving of economics and society that characterized the Roman world.